Okay, here's your witness. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay.
Members take their seats and we'll get started here. We're a couple of minutes late, but we obviously have a quorum, and we appreciate everybody being here, and very much appreciate the Secretary being willing to come up and spend some time with us. And first of all, Mr. Secretary, I want to, on behalf of my sugar beet guys, I want to thank you and the President for what you did to help our industry. It's a huge hit that we took, and you're going to help us survive. So I hope you tell the President as well that we very much appreciate what you guys did. And so we're welcoming you here to the Ag Committee today to review the state of the farm economy. Secretary has, of course, been in his job for, what, 2-3 years now? 3 years? He's still got a little bit of hair left. So he's going to tell us where he sees the farm economy going in the coming year, as well as what's going on over at the department. Today, we are also welcoming our newest member of the committee from New Mexico, Xochitl there, yeah. Xochitl Torres Small, who's from New Mexico's 2nd Congressional District, which has a lot of agriculture. It's a rural district, has a border area, and you know, she's going to be a great new member, and it's going to be a great thing for her district to have her on the committee. So we very much welcome you and look forward to working with you. So we've seen farm income numbers come out for 2019, and really, if it weren't for the payments to farmers through the Market Facilitation Program and disaster payments, farm income would have been in the tank last year. A farm economy that's propped up by payments, I think we all agree, is not what we want, and that's not a healthy farm economy. So I really hope that these markets can return to normal, but I am concerned, the President's comments that we're going to have a third payment potentially. I don't know, maybe you can give us some insight into that, but that makes me wonder if we're talking about third payments with just what's going on with these trade deals and whether things are going to turn around there. I hope they do. You know, that's a promise that's been made to these farmers, and they don't want these payments. They want trade. They want these markets reestablished. I think you understand that. We all understand that, and we all want to work together to try to make that happen. So I told you last year that I appreciated you always shooting straight with us. You've done that. And so I'd like to hear today from you some of your straight talk, how you view things in the farm economy over at the department, and how you see us recovering and thriving, getting back to where we were some years ago. So appreciate you being here, and I recognize the ranking member for a statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary, thank you for being here. I also like to welcome our new member. She represents my 3 grandsons who live in Las Cruces, and so I'm glad to have her on the committee. She'll do a great job. Mr. Secretary, we recognize your hands are full. Your hard work in implementing that 2018 Farm Bill, WIP Plus, Disaster Assistance, Market Facilitation Program has been and continues to be absolutely vital in helping our farmers and ranchers weather the 7th straight year of recession and a brutal string of natural disasters. I know that you and the President have taken some heat for providing market facilitation payments to farmers, but I would hate to see what the situation in farm and ranch country would be right now if you had not taken those steps. We would be having a very different conversation today, akin to the kind of discussions that were taking place during the 1980s farm financial crisis. Our farm and ranchers were targeted by China because the President put his foot down against nearly 30 years of predatory trade practices that hurt American workers as well as our producers. So the first and second MFP payments were as justified as they were critical to our farmers and ranchers. And I strongly believe that unless something gives here very soon, an announcement of a MFP3 will be absolutely vital to the survival of our producers. I'm also grateful that the President communicated directly with farmers and ranchers in rural America last week to assure them that he and his administration are going to continue to stand by them through these difficult times. For those who have ideas on how to improve MFP so it works better for their producers, they should talk with the Secretary about those ideas rather than simply criticize this vital assistance that literally means the difference between farming another year or losing the farm. To the critics, I would say they ought to be a part of the solution rather than always being a part of the problem. Mr. Secretary, I greatly appreciate all that you and the President are doing to open up new markets for our farmers and ranchers. Passage of USMCA, completion of the Phase 1 agreement with China, the U.S.-Japan agreement, the U.S.-Korean agreement, all hold great promises for our farmers and ranchers, and I know that you and the administration will be vigilant in ensuring that the promises become reality. The real potential for bilateral agreements with the U.K. and the EU and with India are also very encouraging, and I especially appreciate your leadership, Mr. Secretary, in pressing the EU to at last adopt Norman Borlaug's Green Revolution, which has saved billions of lives while conserving natural resources worldwide. If we are going to feed 9 billion people in the next 30-plus years, the path Borlaug charted decades ago remains the only acceptable path forward. That's why I'm pleased to work with you in what you're doing, Mr. Secretary, in your recently announced Agriculture Innovation Agenda. Reducing food waste, enhancing water quality, conserving resources, and strengthening the U.S. energy independence are all goals that we can and should be able to agree on. Thank you for leading the way on this effort and for making our nation's farmers and ranchers an integral part of your plan. There is one issue I want to visit with you about, and that is making sure that for the WIP Plus disaster program, that complies with the law and your strong belief that the program should incentivize higher levels of crop insurance, not hinder them. Unfortunately, an unintentional glitch in the WIP Plus formula means that farmers who bought higher levels of coverage are penalized more than those who bought lower coverage in the case of an unharvested acres. I know that this is not your intent, and I believe that the USDA did not desire this result, but it is a serious problem, and I think it ought to be fixed. So we honor the intent of the law and your conviction that disaster aid should never undermine crop insurance. I look forward to our continuing work on this issue to minimize these disparities. For now, I want to reiterate my thanks to you and the President for all you're doing to stand by our farmers and ranchers through these very difficult times. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and I ask that other members submit their opening statements for the record to ensure that there's ample time for questions during this hearing. I'd like to again welcome our witness, Mr. Perdue, the Secretary of the Department of Agriculture. So the floor is yours, and you may take as much time as you consume. I'm not going to run the clock on you, and we very much appreciate you being here.
Well, thank you very much, Chairman Peterson and Ranking Member Conaway. First of all, I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I appreciate really the attendance of the committee today for all the distinguished members here. I look forward to hearing their questions and responding the best I can. You're absolutely right, Mr. Chairman. It was a tough year. Spring of 2019 was tough, and the payments that you all have authorized and facilitated, both indemnity as well as the market facilitation program, made a difference in lives across rural America this last year. It was spring flooding in the Midwest, continuation of cold, wet conditions, and then, as you well know, experienced an early blizzard. Minnesota and the Dakotas, a lot of that crops got frozen in the ground, and some are still yet to be harvested in that way. But despite a tough weather year, and tough trade environment, it's interesting. The facts show that net farm income increased 11.7% from $83.5 billion to $93 billion. And frankly, we've already talked about some of the reason for that. That was the indemnity payments. The safety net of crop insurance spent $9.46 billion in indemnity benefits distributed to producers, along with the $600 million in prevented plant top-off payments that way. So the standing disaster program administered by the Farm Agency, that's the safety net that you all vote for in the Farm Bill, provided nearly $690 million for assistance in 2019. And as you well know, you all participated and supported and voted for an additional $4.5 in ad hoc disaster payments as well for 2018 and 19 losses for those caused by hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, snowstorms, excessive moisture, wildfires, drought, and most anything else that can happen on the farm. So thank you for you all's thoughtfulness and concern about the American farmer and rancher, and we appreciate the ability to be able to do this. And we appreciate, farmers are optimistic, and we hope, we're glad 2019 is in the books, and we look forward to better times in 2020. And as you indicated, Mr. Chairman, we heard the mantra loud and clear over trade, not aid, and I think that's where we're headed. I want to this is not my prepared remarks, but I want to go ahead and address the issue that you mentioned about a third market facilitation program. I'm telling farmers to do what they've always done and plant for the market. The president did make a tweet, but many people and farmers particularly, you know, we always read what we want to see in that. It was preceded by a major word, their two-letter word at the beginning, if. If the trade does not materialize as we anticipate it will, then he's willing to support another one. But I'm telling farmers not to anticipate one, don't expect one. We know there will be some weaning pressure here as people have come to be comfortable with that. Our goal is not to continue a market facilitation program in the ongoing future. The safety net that you all designed under the crop insurance program and the other programs through USDA, we believe is adequate for the future in that regard. I'm telling farmers that if we get the export, we get the trade, and we don't see prices increase, then market facilitation program was not a price support program. It was a trade disruption program, not price support. So if we see trade increase and prices don't go up, that's a market signal to farmers who are producing too much. And that's the way the markets have always worked. When markets, we have more supply and less demand, prices go down. Less supply, more demand, prices go up. So don't look for us to support a market facilitation program as a price support program. Look at it for a trade disruption program. That was the principle and the foundation of the original, both market facilitation programs regarding of trade disruption. So I want to be clear about that. We can talk more about that in the questions, but I really wanted to get that out since you mentioned it early about that. But we do in USDA remain committed to delivering those programs of support that you all have authorized of those that need it most. I think the new trade deals and the strong consumer demand in the United States and abroad are a signal that bright days are ahead. None of us obviously know what the impact is going to be with the coronavirus, and that's yet to be determined. We're going to do what we've always done and do what needs to be done in that regard, nationally and internationally in that way. The good news is we serve a group of people who are ultimate optimists. It takes that spirit and optimism every year to take their equity and put it in the ground and hope a good crop and weather makes it productive. And that's why it's fun to serve these folks. And they've made it perfectly clear to me that they'd rather have trade, not aid. And it's certainly more fulfilling when we grow and produce things rather than getting a check in the mailbox. So the phase one deal with China, I'm encouraged by USMCA, Japan, the renewal of the chorus arrangement. I think, and again, to all the smaller countries, the singles that Ambassador Lighthizer talks about, I think will set us up for a great future. I'm not a market prognosticator, and I don't want to pretend one, but I think we've seen, based on the future of the trade deals, I think we've seen lows put in for the recent area. It's not going to just climb up. We were disappointed that we didn't see prices respond more in the China phase one deal. But obviously the market and all farmers kind of act like they're from Missouri. They want to see it rather than hear about it. And I think that's what we're seeing that way. So I think that's what we will see. The good news about that is from a technical level at USDA and working with the technicians in China, they are doing the kind of things that it's going to take to facilitate that trade. A lot of those non-trade barriers, they're working on those types of things on an ongoing basis. We see a sincerity in them living up to the agreement, those hardline numbers that Ambassador Lighthizer negotiated. We see a commitment to doing that. We're going to be tracking that. Right now, we're in a trusting but verifying environment. That's what we'll continue to report to you all in the President as we go forward. The unilateral ability to enforce that, I think, is a very powerful tool in that regard. So we appreciate these trade agreements. That's what farmers want to see, is trade, not aid. So last week, as you may have heard, we also tried to support the ethanol market by declaring that we will promote another infrastructure program and helping to move to E15 year-round. The President, as you know, created the year-round market for E15, or authorized that, and we'll we'll be doing a higher blends infrastructure incentive program of $100 million in helping the retailers to move to infrastructure that can support ethanol E15 and B20 and higher as we go forward. We're taking applications. It'll be done on a competitive basis as people and scored, and really to make sure we get skin in the game from the retailers as well as just accepting a grant. So our goal at USDA is to work all across the environment to the economy to increase rural prosperity. This week we're announcing more rules on employment and training programs to help promote long-term success and self-sufficiency as we try to move people into employment. And I do want to tell you, I think we've gotten great results and great acclaim out here in putting the money to work that you all did with the Reconnect program. You know how important broadband is to our whole country. I think it has the potential to be transformative, and where we're able to go in these communities and a lot of times fiber to the home, it's going to be life-changing for many of your citizens out there. And we've had good results and good feelings where that happens. We just need to continue. We've opened up the second round of applications. It'll close, I think, here the 16th of March, and more of your communities will be served based on the second and third round that you gave, $1.1 billion in that way for Reconnect and broadband across the country. So I think Ranking Member Conaway talked about the agriculture innovation agenda to best align our programs and research and provide farmers the tools they need to continue to be innovative and successful. We're talking about the miracle of American agriculture for the last 75 years has just been phenomenal in its productivity, reducing its environmental footprint, doing more with less, and actually less arable acres, 10% less acres, and 400% increase. That's a real miracle that we don't talk about a lot, but I'm going to be talking more about it. I think, again, I don't see my friend Congressman Scott here, but I know Al and others are, Mr. Lawson, I know y'all are interested in the program you all did on the future of 1890s universities. We've gotten that, because of you, we're going to be welcoming those students holding those scholarships here for this fall, and I've visited several of them, and they're excited about that aspect as well. So all in all, we've been working to implement the 2018 Farm Bill and stood up the key new programs that you all did, like Dairy Margin Coverage Program and rules for industrial hemp. And obviously, we've had a busy year, certainly with a Farm Bill implementation, another market facilitation program, ad hoc disaster program, and there's still a lot of work to be done. As you well know, one of the other issues that we have to deal with is a stable, reliable ag labor workforce in order to maintain the best and most competitive agricultural sector in the world. And we look forward to working with Congress to do that. So I just want you to know I love this job. It's an honor to serve as the 31st Secretary of Agriculture for the United States of America, and I'm proud of the great strides. We got a great team over there. We got 100,000 plus good folks that just want to do good for America, and I'm proud of them. And we continue to try to work every day in making USDA the most effective, the most efficient, and most customer-focused department in the federal government. So thank you for the opportunity to be here and to make that statement uninhibited. So I look forward to your questions, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. May I give you this job, you know? It might not be all that bad. So I want to remind members that they will be recognized for questioning in order of seniority, those including the members that were here at the start of the hearing. And after that, you're going to be recognized in the order of arrival. So with that, I would recognize myself for a couple of questions. First, as I said, we really appreciate you getting the announcement on the disaster for what happened to us in the sugar beet area last week. The other issue I'm getting, or questions I'm getting from my constituents, is about the quality loss issue that's part of the WIP Plus. I know you're working on that, as I understand it. Could you kind of give us an update on where you're at with that and when we might be able to see some kind of announcement about where that's all at?
The quality loss provisions, as you know, many of the the crops that are standing in the field, some yet to be harvested. Many of them suffered weight loss issues and other quality loss issues that depress their prices when they're sold. They may have volume, but the quality is a huge disadvantage, and you all authorize us to look into the disaster provision over quality loss. It's a more complex thing. It's much more subjective and not as data-driven as others, but we're currently working on devising those rules, and it'll have to be rules-based, so it's never as fast as I'd like to do it right away, but it'll be rules-based. We'll open that rule as soon as possible so farmers can take advantage of the quality loss provisions that you all authorized.
You don't want to hazard any kind of a guess on how long this is going to take?
I would say probably in the April-May time period.
Okay. Thank you. The other thing that we've heard from back home and around the country is that folks went into their local FSA office to sign up for the general CRP sign-up. Yeah, that just closed. I guess it closed on the 28th. And we're told that in some cases that the software wasn't working and that the handbook wasn't available, apparently, in those county offices. So this meant that landowners weren't able to see what their county rental rate might have been so that they could take that into consideration when they were deciding whether to make an offer or not. So are you able to tell us, you know, in light of all of that, how many offers were actually received during this sign-up and how many acres were offered? Do you have any information on that?
Mr. Chairman, because of the software glitch and other types of things of people coming in at the end to sign up, we let everyone, while we didn't extend, we put everybody's name who was interested, even in inquiring, on a register. And they will be eligible to work through this if they came in and the software was not available, which allowed them to look at all their potential outcomes of their farms, and we didn't have that or information they needed, then they will be able to finish that up and be included in the sign-up. That's the reason we don't have good numbers today of that. We had some preliminary numbers, but we don't have good sound numbers. We'll get those numbers to the you all and members of the committee as soon as we can process all those, and I think that will be soon. I'm not talking about weeks. I'm talking about really days in that area of processing those.
So you don't have a list of these people that got in there and didn't get, how many people are involved in that?
We have a register of those who were not able to get there, whether it was a software glitch or they just got there and there was a line there. So,
But you don't have any idea how many people that is nationwide that are on that register?
I'm sure FSA does. I don't have those numbers with me here today.
So you could find out. If you know, I'd like to have that information.
I surely will. I
So-
feel like we can get that to you by the end of the day.
So however many people that is, that they're going to be able to be processed before this.
Absolutely, that's the commitment. And we told them that when they came in, if there were a glitch and we couldn't have the software where they could see all their options, we put them on a register. But if they came in and we just didn't, they came in a group of people and we didn't have time to get to them, we put them on a register with a commitment that they would absolutely be eligible.
So have these technical issues been fixed now at this time?
I'm sorry?
Are these technical issues that
They-
were
They are resolved, and I'm frankly embarrassed that we had them at all. I got a little peeved about that, actually.
And the handbooks are out? The handbooks are out to
Yes,
the
sir.
counties?
The information and should be all there. I don't know how many places there were limitations of not having a handbook of all the provisions of the program. We try to do a good job at that. We had these rules out in December. I would have thought everyone would have known all the provisions there, but yes.
So I assume that you're not entertaining any requests to have the CRP reopened?
No, I think we're amenable to that. Obviously, I want to see what the numbers look like. Our target goal for this year is 24.5 million acres of variety, whether it's grasslands or other types of working lands and those sort of things. But my goal is to reach that target. I think that's your goal. Those are the targets you all set. And I'm not saying that your rules call for at least one general sign-up a year, but I'm not saying that we can't have more than one.
Well, I appreciate that, and I think some of the folks have been calling me would be pleased to hear that there's some flexibility there if you find out that we didn't have that good of a sign-up.
I think what we want to do is look at the numbers and be wise about how we look at those numbers. As you all know, you all changed some of the provisions that way, and we want to see what the response is from the farm community to know how to go forward.
Yeah, and I'm running over a little bit, but on the GRP, the Grassland Reserve Program, that sign-up doesn't start until you're done with CRP.
That's right.
So that means it'll be put off for, what, a month or two before it starts?
I think that's going to be in March as well.
Okay. So I'm still getting feedback from around the country that people don't know about this program. And even in your FSA offices, they don't seem to know about this. And the farmers don't seem to know about it. The cattlemen don't know about it. So whatever you can do to try to do a better job of getting the information out about the Grassland Reserve Program and, you know, hopefully get the good sign-up out of that situation, I think would be appreciated, at least from this member.
We'll do our best to, again, communicate the program. If farmers don't know about it, that's bad. If we don't know about it, that's horrible. And we'll make sure that our people in our FSA offices certainly know the program, can talk about farmers as they come in to do that. You know that you all created this and expanded the acres because of wildlife and other water quality issues, and really giving people an opportunity to take fragile land out of production and maybe improve their overall profitability. So it's an important program that we want to do well. If we're not doing our job in helping people understand what it is, I'll have to figure out what it is, how we've communicated that, and whether we're just doing a website or whether we're actually evangelizing that program.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Conaway, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I have a report here on the Market Facilitation Payment Program that was published by the Ag and Food Policy Center at Texas A&M. I'd like to submit that for the record.
No objection.
This report determines that a significantly higher number of farms would be in poor financial condition and less likely to cash flow without the assistance provided by the administration. The report also found there is no regional bias built into how county payment rates were calculated, and observes that 70% of the aid went to Midwestern states. Given the competing narrative that MFP is allegedly biased towards Southern producers, Mr. Secretary, would you explain to us the methodology about how the USDA determined those county payment rates for the second round?
I'll do my best, Congressman. I think, first of all, my instructions to our economists were Sergeant Webb, just the facts, sir. In this area, there was no predetermined regional, demographic, or sector bias in any of this. In fact, I'd like to show you. I think you mentioned something. I've got a chart here for your committee that shows you the states that here that have there. We'll provide an electronic copy with all of that. But the darker states are where the highest payments were. This is a 700 to $1.6 billion there per state. These lighter colors, it goes up lighter that way. So I think you can see, Mr. Conaway, your state did okay along with Illinois and Kansas and Iowa and Minnesota in that way in those states. So that's kind of where the money came down. I know there have been some press reports about trying to favor one region or another. That was not the case. We let the chips fall where they may. It was a trade disruption program, and if you remember the first year, we hadn't traded a lot of corn to China, so there was a big problem with how corn really responded to soybeans in that area. We took a different approach based on the feedback we got from you all and constituents across the country, and went to a per acre concept here that I thought was better received. It's, again, probably not perfect. Anyone can have a different, if you ask 10 economists there, you're probably going to get 12 opinions about how this could be done in that way. So I thought we did a pretty good job in trying to respond to the marketplace, but I think the complaints about it being regional biased are just unfounded.
Well, I agree with you. I think the cherry picking a couple of counties in two different states and trying to compare those is disingenuous by our Senate colleagues that have posited this issue.
I was sort of proud of the fact that the chairman's congressional district got more money than all the state of Georgia did.
Facts are a pesky thing. Facts are a pesky thing. So,
Just doing my job.
Mr. Secretary, the gene editing and biotechnology advances that have been the potential to transform our agriculture industry are facing some issues. With FDA saying that gene editing of animal traits is a FDA issue, can you, in your discussions with producers, what challenges the livestock community identified with the FDA's regulatory process, and how can we help you and the administration resolve these issues?
Well, thank you for the question. I think this is an issue we've been involved in for a couple of years, and interagency developments. We're actually making progress in interagency developments and conversation, moving to the principles level between FDA and USDA in this regard, as well as moving it to NEC level and further if need be in trying to do that. These techniques, these biological techniques were not even thought about, contemplated in the 1980s when it was parsed out about how it happened. We've done, I think, at USDA a good job on new plant technology, and the Part 340, the secure rule will be coming out about plants on non-transgenic type of gene editing will not be determined to be eligible for registration if they were the same types of things that could be done through natural breeding techniques. The same thing can happen with animals, and you know that we've already got some discoveries out here that could have animal diseases there. In plants, we can do things like peanut allergies and in those kind of editing. Non-transgenic, we're not taking other genes from other parts, animals or plants in order to do that. But I think we're making progress. FDA, honestly, if you want to know the truth, it almost comes down to more to a committee jurisdictional issue, I think, than anything else. And that may be one way where you all can help in that regard with your colleagues over that. We do believe that the lost opportunity, if these type of new techniques go to Argentina, Brazil, who already set up open doors, Canada, China, other types, and we lose our edge in innovation, it's kind of the beginning of a long haul for American agriculture. There are things out there that are amazing, that are safe, healthy, and the FDA intends to continue to develop these as drugs, and you know how long it takes drugs to get approved, and that's the challenge we have. These are real-world opportunities we've got, and we'll have a lost opportunity if we don't keep regulatory agencies up with the world.
Mr. Secretary, thank you for that, and thank you for the great work your team is doing. I know your FSA guys are overworked throughout this entire process, and just acknowledging from our side of the room that certainly appreciate all their hard work on behalf of producers throughout the nation with all the work we put on them this past 2 years. So thank you for that. I yield back.
Thanks, gentlemen. Gentleman from California, Mr. Costa.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Secretary, we're always pleased to see you here, and as you get around the country, and you do a good job, and we like you to continue to come to California. I know you were there last month, and we appreciate that. I have a couple questions here I want to go quickly on. Is there going to be a Phase 2 trade agreement with Japan, and will that include more agriculture commodities and SPS protections, and if so, when? You, Ambassador Lighthouse, are looking at that?
I think labeling this initial agreement with Japan as Phase 1, I think it means that there will be a pretty good deal in the Phase 1, about $7 billion worth in ag products in that area, leveling these tariffs that would have been essentially where we were in some of the early agreements in that way, but making a significant difference in leveling the playing field for our producers.
You think there's going to be a Phase 2 that's going to come up?
I do believe they will, yeah.
And within the next year?
I can't tell you the time frame on that.
Okay. You also talked, since we're in Asia right now, and you talked about the Phase 1 of the China agreement, the President mentioned a number last month after the conclusion of the signing that seemed much higher than previous purchases by China in the past by agriculture commodities throughout the country. what's your realistic expectation now with the coronavirus? We've got other issues. We've got products that have been sent from California that are sitting in the ports. Their ability to get those products off the ports and maintain refrigeration and other factors are of concern. We have people going over there these days. You want to give us a quick summary?
Sure. The hardline numbers were $40 to $50 billion, which
Yeah, I thought our president had 200 billion. That seemed
that was
little.
the total deal. 40 to 50 was the agricultural portion of that. 200 billion was the overall deal on phase one. 40 to 50 was the agricultural portion, which essentially doubles ag exports to China. We're encouraged, as I indicated. I think that the signals are they want to comply. We don't yet know what the effect of coronavirus will be on China or really the globe or economically here, but we see signals that they want to fulfill that commitment.
Do we have USDA people over there trying to deal with the initial issues involving quarantine and the ability to ship product?
We do. We have.
You want to keep the committee informed of that effort?
We will.
All right. I want to switch over to the why I look at the MFP, the Market Facilitation Program, and the data there, and I don't think California's in the top 10, and I want to know why more specialty crops haven't been included, like citrus, stone fruit, berries, cashews, olives, tomatoes, that have had substantial losses to China and yet have not been a part of the Market Facilitation Program.
I think, again, you know the types of crops produced in California. It is a large export. I believe
44% of our product.
Yeah, I think if you check with your almond people, the last market facilitation program included those specialty crops. The first one we did not, and those types of areas, as well as the purchasing program, they participated in that.
Is the department looking for expansion of additional specialty crops?
In which way
Well, there are 10 right now and there's a whole host of other, I mean, we grow a lot, as you noted.
is the market facilitation program?
Yeah.
We don't have any plans to expand that. I think that has been, that's over with. Mr. Chairman, could I get a little more volume on the hearing? I'm having a little bit difficulty hearing the.
I'll try to speak a little louder.
Okay, all right,
That's
thank you.
helpful, Mr. Secretary. Also, the efforts on the payments with Farm Services Agency continue to be problematic, it seems. We have people that have applied in 2019, in some cases in 2018. We've continued to ask you folks and then locally with the FSA offices why they haven't processed in a more timely manner. Are we looking at bringing more personnel to expedite that?
We're always trying to hire, but I'd love to know specifically if people have not gotten those kind of payments in that kind of period of time.
I'd be happy to provide you a list
Well, surely, absolutely, we'll look into that.
in the areas that I am aware of.
Usually, it's a matter of a lack of data, of information that we have to validate and verify.
All right. I'll yield back the balance of my time. Thank you very much. Keep up the good work.
Thank you, gentlemen. Gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Thompson. 5 minutes.
Chairman, thank you. Mr. Secretary, it's good to see you. Thank you for your leadership. Mr. Secretary, in your testimony references the exceptional new challenges that farmers across the U.S. faced recently with unprecedented widespread natural disasters, floods, droughts, blizzards, and freezes. These disasters exposed gaps in coverage and led to additional ad hoc assistance. What improvements do you think that we can make to crop insurance to make it even more effective in these disaster situations?
I think we have to tread very carefully. I think crop insurance does a great job as a general safety net. I think it does not contemplate catastrophic disasters like hurricanes and floods, frankly. And it can be used for droughts and those sorts of things. But I think, I don't know that we would want to develop a program as broadly as one that contemplated huge disaster programs.
This year, we hope to reauthorize the U.S. Grain Standards Act. Can you share with us the importance of the Federal Grain Inspection Enterprise on our ability to market grain both here and abroad?
I would love to. This is one of the issues we're really having discussions with China right now, and frankly, our colleagues in the Western Hemisphere, the major producers of beans, China, this is one of the ways China has sort of harassed our shipments there, calling, making sure we put weed seeds on the phytosanitary list. That is a grain standard, not a phytosanitary issue, and one which we are discussing with China as we speak about that. They put out an edict that wanted to declare that. So grain standards are very important, just like any kind of food safety standards internationally, and we make take great pains to try to agree internationally on those standards and where everyone can be assured of what they're being judged by when they ship grain back and forth.
I want to thank you and your team for all your work and support for USMCA. This agreement holds obviously tremendous potential for U.S. agriculture and for the dairy sector in particular, as we were kind of locked out of that Canadian market. To get the full benefit, though, it's going to be essential we know exactly how Canada and Mexico plan to implement their commitments. And with Canada, important details need to be finalized on dairy market access. In the case of Mexico, we need more clarity on how they will allow common cheese names. Now, since USDA plays an incredibly important role in working with the U.S. trade representative on all the fine print of our trade agreements, what is the department doing to ensure proper USMCA implementation by our trading partners?
Well, 2 weeks ago, I met with my Canadian peer, Minister Bibeau, and asked her, were there any issues regarding the Canadian ratification of that? She expects that to be concluded very quickly with no changes. I think we're anxious to get all those moving. Geographical indicators, as you mentioned, for cheese is something that we continually fight against internationally in that way. That's an EU plan over some of those names. They're trying to patent names that have been in the marketplace for many years, and we've had fairly good success with Mexico in accepting that.
Just changing one last gear here, the U.S. Forest Service maintenance backlog is more than $5.2 billion. It's the second largest backlog between the 4 federal land management agencies. What steps is the Forest Service taking to minimize maintenance backlog for the Forest Service, and what is the service doing to increase access to public lands and generate more revenue for our rural communities?
Right. What you all did, I think, already with the forest fire fix, is the funding fix on that is one of the best things. We got into backlogs because we were having taken operational maintenance money there to suppress fire. What you did there beginning this fiscal year enables us to have a plan of maintenance there. I think when you look at the budget for this year too and the proposals, you'll also see backlog maintenance money attributed to that. So we want to do that. Many of those are roads and bridges that address the really issue that you ask about, and that's public access. We want to make sure the public can get into these places. I don't want to see gates because of this closed, because of maintenance and those sort of things. We're also encouraging a huge volunteer network, and we've got a lot of NGOs across the country that work with us on helping to improve the access through roads and bridges.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, gentlemen. The gentlelady from Ohio, Ms. Fudge.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here today. Mr. Secretary, I represent one of the poorest districts in the United States. More than 1 in 6 Cuyahoga County residents lack access to nutritious food every day. SNAP provides critical nutrition assistance to nearly 200,000 people in Cuyahoga County, including 82,000 children. Unfortunately for poor Americans in my district and across the country, you and the administration are actively working to finalize and implement 3 SNAP rules that will increase food insecurity and gut state flexibility, which I thought was something very important to you, to provide people in need with critical life-saving food assistance. Altogether, roughly 4 million people would be kicked off SNAP, and nearly 1 million children will lose their automatic access to free school meals. The rules amount to about $19 billion in cuts to SNAP over 5 years. This comes very close to the $22 billion handed out to ailing farmers impacted by a trade war that was started by this administration. We can all agree affected farmers should be compensated. However, giving farmers billions in federal assistance shouldn't mean taking those same billions from food insecure people. It sounds to me like you are using administrative pay-go to pick winners and losers and pit food producers and consumers against each other. If the administration can understand farmers are hurting, and we can, surely you can empathize with our nation's hungry. I ask, where is your commitment to feed everyone? Just as concerning are reports that more than 1/2 of the initial farm bailout funds were paid to the top 10% of U.S. farmers. There are recent reports of payments going to farmers previously convicted or accused of fraudulently obtaining federal agricultural subsidies. Now, if that is true, it is certainly concerning and irresponsible, but it as well may be illegal, because as you know, as I do, federal law requires farmers convicted of felony fraud to be temporarily barred from USDA programs. I'd like to follow up with that with your staff, if you would have someone contact my office. Now to my questions. Okay. We are all monitoring the spread of coronavirus in the United States, which you quite rightly called a pandemic some time ago. On April 1st, USDA is planning to implement a final rule to strip SNAP away from 700,000 people in need. Given the timing and the anticipated strain on our nation's food banks, are you willing to delay the implementation of this final rule?
No, ma'am, we have no plans to eliminate. We do have flexibility, though, if there is an outbreak here to relieve those issues. But until we see that here, we're willing to move just as flexible as we do in natural disasters. If there's a health emergency and a disaster, we will do that here as well.
Thank you. Lastly, certainly I've made no secret of my concerns with your civil rights enforcement. The resignation of Naomi Earp presents an opportunity to you, to USDA, to show its employees and the people it serves that the department is committed to overcoming its long history of discrimination. I understand that you have appointed Mr. Westhill to head the Civil Rights Office. As chair of the subcommittee responsible for oversight of the department, I just want to be clear that I'm going to hold him as responsible as we did Ms. Earp, and I certainly hope that your staffing will find itself in a position that raises morale, which the morale is at the bottom right now, that we will finally staff up the offices that are saying that there are thousands of people short, that we will do what the USDA is intended to do and take care of the people it is intended to serve. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, gentlelady. Gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Secretary, I was in the old governor's office the other day with Secretary Kemp, and when you said you got upset, I had a little bit of a flashback there to budget meetings. You're a great governor, and you've been a great asset for the state of Georgia, and I'm glad that you're the Secretary of Ag and appreciate your support of our producers. You mentioned the E15. I have a couple of things. I just have one thing I want to mention there. If E15 is going to become more prevalent in the marketplace, then the labeling standard needs to be put on the pumps that cautions people that if you put E15 in a marine engine or a chainsaw engine or a high-performance engine, that you're absolutely going to destroy that engine. I have no problem with E15 with being expanded. I do have a problem without a labeling standard that cautions the consumer that if put in certain engines, it will destroy that engine. And so any help with that certainly would appreciate as we work on the labeling.
That falls under the EPA, of course, but we are
That's
working
right.
with them. They've got a fairly good, strong skulls and crossbones on there now, but like it causes a lot of things. But that's certainly one of those that needs to be included.
So while we're on labeling, it does concern me from our farmer standpoint that we have non-dairy products that are being marketed as milk. We have non-meat products being marketed as meat. And we have non-rice products being marketed as rice. My wife tricked me into eating cauliflower the other night, and it was actually the best cauliflower I've ever had, although I don't intend to have it again. But I do think that this is an area that we need to be very careful of as as we push forward. And I do think that it has the potential to create some disruptions for the producers. With that said, as you know, I represent your hometown, and you mentioned that farm income was actually up. I'd be interested if you have any studies on that and which regions and which commodities that it's actually up in. Certainly in our area where we've been hit by natural disasters and other things, we would, I think, be on the low end of the totem pole in that. But after watching the crop insurance and disaster payments, I have two suggestions. One is, if there's any way for this year that we can find a way to include the value of the MFP in the price loss coverage, I think it would be helpful to our farmers and the lending institutions. I don't know that you can legally do it, but as you know, as the commodity prices have come down, the value of the crop insurance is not there to cover the loans that the farmers have to obtain. And then in disasters, can we find a way to better integrate the actual loss data from the land grant institutions into the disaster payment calculations? I know we can't just take a farmer that says, hey, I had 3 bales to the acre, but we did have actual data from the land grant institutions this year. And unfortunately, we were not able to incorporate that into the loss data on the disaster payments. Any comments?
Well, I think we have to be very careful, obviously, in both the loss data based on what I think many of your constituents wanted to have happen. When they had the hurricane come in, they knew they were harvesting 3 bales of cotton to the acre, but insurance may not have covered that amount. And that's really, right. They did lose that because when they got back in, there was nothing left to harvest in that way. So there were losses that way. I think it's very difficult that's where the ad hoc disaster program comes in. That's what we're trying to address with that. One of the other challenges is that we don't think the taxpayer should support over 100% of loss. And that's where I agree 100% that's where some of the other things comes in that many farmers wanted. They wanted to pay for that huge crop and plus, and that's the challenge.
We can never make somebody more than whole. That would destroy the support for the ag community throughout the country. I agree with you 100% on that. I do have a suggestion as we move to write the next farm bill over the next couple of years, is that if there's a way in working with the risk management people in your office that we're able to create a harvest type contract where if that 3 bale per acre crop is on the ground and the farmer was only able to insure 1 bale per acre because of historical averages, that if we have the data from the land grant institutions, and I think it's got to be appraised before they can insure it, that we allow them to have some type of step-up coverage prior to harvest once the crop has been produced.
I'm asking our RMA leader, Martin Barbary, right now on disaster losses. How do we adjust that for pricing and yields that way? We're looking at it. I don't know how much legal flexibility we have in that way in looking, but I understand what you're saying. I understand the challenges from the producer's perspective, and we want to be as flexible as we can.
One quick suggestion on that would be to allow them to cup out more of the bad years. Might allow them to insure more of the yield. With that, Mr. Secretary, I appreciate you and our friendship and what you do for the country and the state of Georgia. And I've got to get an armed service meeting.
Thank you, gentlemen. Gentlelady from Connecticut, Mercedes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. I know there's a lot we're talking about on the committee, but when I have the Secretary in front of me, I have to talk about what's important to me and my constituents. I looked, and you mentioned several of your department's proposals to gut SNAP benefits in your written testimony that was submitted to the committee. Yet there's no mention that the President's budget request for fiscal year 2021 revived your previous proposal to take away benefits from households and replace them with what you're calling harvest boxes of pre-selected non-perishable food items. My question to you is, do you think that SNAP recipients are incapable of choosing groceries for themselves or their families?
No, we do not, in answer to your question. This is a proposal we've suggested we think would still like to have an opportunity for a pilot. As you know, many of your constituents and others are getting their food delivered at home, which would be essentially the choices that we would hope to provide in a harvest box.
Yeah, I saw that this was being compared to programs like Blue Apron. I doubt that that's what it would be like, but there's little or no evidence that this proposal would lower costs for the USDA or the American taxpayer. In reality, the proposal is likely more expensive when you consider cost burdens on states, and it'll cost $2.3 billion in grocery sales and $368,000 in grocer jobs. What I can't find is how this plan would be implemented. So I guess I'm going to ask you if you can expand on how this program would be delivered. Have you thought about who would deliver the boxes? Or what will we do in the event that a box got lost or stolen? Or are there plans for delivery in the wake of a disaster or a storm? You know, in my area, we have many winter storms. How would we deliver benefits to people who don't have an address? Has the department investigated any of those avenues in what you call a pilot?
Yes, we spent a good bit of time on many of that. You know that in many ways, obviously, some food's delivered at home. You know the statistics over that, the delivery mechanism, the logistics being developed in that way.
No, I don't know. That's why I'm asking you. Can you explain how this program would be implemented? Or just if you've thought about how that would take place?
We have thought about that, and I'd love to have an extended conversation with you about that. I'm not sure this is the way to do that, but this is the place to do that. But there was a lot of information, a lot of study put into that about the home delivery there, giving people a choice, maybe an app on their phone of the groceries they want to deliver there, and using commercial distributions. We're working with both Amazon, Walmart, and others who express great interest in utilizing these services.
Is this information anywhere where I can access it? Because I've spent a lot of time trying to look up the details of it, and I can't find it.
I'd be happy to have our FNS people deliver to you what we discovered, yes.
Is it available anywhere, or do you have to individually request it? Because I'm sure other people would like to see the same information.
I don't know if it's, we want to be responsive to you members of Congress. I'm not sure of the kind of depth of questions you ask, whether that information and extension and extensiveness is out there or not, but we can provide it, and if you want to make it public, then that'd be fine.
Well, yes, I guess I'm asking then, can you provide it? Because this is a plan that has been introduced multiple times in multiple budgets. I would imagine that the way it will be implemented should be well thought out and thoroughly investigated at this point. This isn't the first time this came up in a budget.
The first time? It's been in, I think it's been in 3 budgets.
Exactly, that's what I'm saying. This has been in
We would appreciate the
multiple
opportunity to
budgets.
implement it, and we'll have all the details you need.
I think our role is to look at the plan for implementation before it happens, not after. So again, if you could just, I would love that. If you can, I'll have my office follow up, but if you have it, I would imagine you have it planned out to the letter now, since it's been introduced or proposed in 3 separate budgets, so it's something that's been going on in an ongoing conversation for many years. So I would like to see it, so that I could share it out. And just as part of that, I would ask you for specifically how you would address people with food allergies or medical needs if these are generic pre-selected boxes that would be going out. That's all I have, Mr. Chair. I yield back. Thank you.
Thanks, gentlelady. Gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Crawford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. You touched on something earlier. I think my friend from Pennsylvania brought this up with the Grain Standards Act and how that impacts trade and so on. And you mentioned sort of the overlap between our grain standards and sanitary considerations. That brings me to the question, I kind of got to ask this on behalf of my rice farmers. So we've been talking about importing, or exporting rather, to China for 20 plus years, and we have yet to export any rice to China. And all of it tends to come back to this, you know, sort of moving standard that they have there. I wonder if you could maybe provide a little more insight into where we stand today, what the potential is for us to actually move some rice into China at some point in the near future.
Based on the Phase 1 agreement, Congressman, I'm pretty optimistic we'll get rice into China. Those non-tariff trade barriers were some of the things I was referencing earlier that we're dealing with from a technical level. That's the kind of harassment that we've had in that regard, and rice would be included in that. It was obviously one of the commodities that was anticipated, and it'd be a great market that hadn't been available in rice. So we're looking forward to that.
Excellent. Let me change gears a little bit. I have some concerns about the aging population of our farm producers. So we talk about the aging workforce, but I really want to focus on the actual producers, where we see that the trajectory is not going in the right direction with regard to the age of our actual farmers. And I know at your a few weeks ago at the USDA Outlook Conference, you highlighted innovation and the future of ag producers and so on. That's got to be a consideration. I'm wondering what we can do here in this body to assist you in helping us to change the trajectory and getting more young people engaged on the production side of agriculture.
Honestly, I think the real answer to your question is young people are smart. They do what's in their economic best interest. I think the profitability of agriculture needs to show them a bright, promising future, where if they put their efforts into farming, then they can have a lifestyle like their colleagues that choose to go to town and work. So that's the ultimate answer there. You've put programs in for beginning and new farmers, but ultimately it comes down, we talk about sustainability a lot. We're talking about environmental sustainability, social sustainability of available and affordable food, but there's also an economic sustainability.
Absolutely.
We can't expect farmers to come into the business and not being able to make a livelihood like they could. We know that the average income of farmers is not comparable to many other jobs in that way.
Well, given the, the cost of doing business and what the return on that investment is, it doesn't make for a very attractive opportunity for young people. And so, we've talked about policy, about what the federal government can do to incentivize young people for years. It's nothing new. We've talked about this for a long time. And I don't see that we're doing anything right here in regard to that. We're still seeing that struggle take place, and I haven't seen any measurable improvement in that. So are there things that we can identify that, from your perspective, that you could say, stop doing that? Don't do that anymore because it's not helping. Because I know it's a market-based, it's market-driven largely. So I just kind of want to get your insight on that. What could, lessons learned, what can we do differently?
Let me tell you one of the things I think you all did positively that helped. You readjusted the CRP payment limits or per acre this year. That was really keeping a lot of young farmers out of the business. Senior farmers were using that kind of a retirement program and rather than letting their farm be utilized for productive agriculture from the next generation. So that's one of the things that you all did. I think that will help in that regard. We had complaints about that, and we would, address that together.
So ironically, that wasn't geared toward trying to address the young farmer. It's just a byproduct of having done that, correct?
That's right.
So, again, I know that we kind of struggle with this because we're trying to do the right thing by the next generation, but sometimes it doesn't manifest that way in reality. And so, I agree with you. I think we just need to take a more of a market-based approach to help drive young people into the business, but I think the market needs to catch up with us on that at some point, but there are limits, obviously, and what we're dealing with now with regard to trade is probably as much of a factor as anything, wouldn't you say?
We did see a lot of bright young people come back into agriculture that might have been born there, went off to town in those periods of years from 8 to 14. They came back, their fathers and mothers said, we feel like we can support another family member here, another family group. We saw them come in. Honestly, sadly, those are the ones that are hurting the most from the downturn since that period of time. So I kind of go back to the original thing. It's a macroeconomic issue. Farming is tough. It's risky and it's tough. It's a tough life. You almost got to be committed to it in a different way, but productivity is the key. Ag innovation is the key. Those are the things that we're doing.
Gentleman's time is up.
I guess I'm done.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Mr. Delgado, the gentleman from New York, you're recognized 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Secretary Perdue, it's good to see you. During our last committee exchange in February, of last year, you may recall that I asked you what could be done to improve the plight of small family farms, especially dairy farmers, whose numbers have been in decline for many years. And in your answer, and I want to quote, you said, quote, "These are economy of scale issues that impact the entire economy, not just agriculture. And the economy of scale for a small dairy is going to be extremely difficult going forward, even with the new Farm Bill. I don't think any of us would submit that we're compelled to keep anyone in business if it is not profitable," end quote. Since that conversation, the situation has become very dire, more dire, as evidenced by the trade aid. In 2019, we saw the largest decline in dairy operations in more than 15 years. I believe that priorities dictate policies, and when it comes to your agency's priorities, I'm concerned that we're not seeing the kind of recalibration needed to prioritize and assist our small farms. So my question is, what, if any, plans is the USDA considering to provide assistance to and create new market opportunities for our small family farms?
What we see most effective is value-added grants that we see the dairies that are surviving, particularly the smaller dairies, are more successful when they add processing there and creameries. We've been losing dairy farms for a number of years. Sadly, the number of cows and number of dairies are down, but the milk production's up. That's really the challenge. That's why we see the continued price pressure that make it very difficult for smaller dairies. I was visiting with the organic dairy providers the other day, and many of them have small producers. There's a large organic dairy co-op that has a lot of smaller producers, a lot of cows under herd number under 75, which is a very small dairy today. So they're taking those kind of actions to do that. The fact remains that the economy of scale with equipment, land, cows, and others, it's a very difficult economic challenge to do that. I thought you all did a good job in the dairy market coverage program, in the Farm Bill, by skewing that to smaller dairies and giving them up to 5 million pounds of milk. And aside from that, it's that other types of programs, we're open to those, and I think we're trying to fulfill that. But that's a difficult life.
Thank you. So you mentioned your visit to our organic dairy farm, and I just want to flag for you, and I'm interested to get your thoughts on this. The proposed budget by the administration reduces funding for the national organic program. It also cuts more than $25 billion from crop insurance over the next 10 years and reduces funding of the Ag Conservation Easement Program as well. Do you believe this is consistent with supporting small farms and dairy farms?
Well, I think, again, overall budget is work. It's proposed to you all. You know that you all, the appropriators, the president makes and presents his budget that way, and you all have been kind in the past to do that. We think certainly some of these programs, as I mentioned, the organic program has been the lifesaver for many small dairy farms. Obviously, not everyone can participate in that. We are taking efforts.
So it wouldn't be helpful, though, it sounds like. If you're saying it can be a lifesaver, then it probably wouldn't be helpful to reduce the funding around it.
I think it would be helpful to have those programs.
Right. The other piece that I want to just clarify is the trade aid. You know, the reports, while they might not be regionally biased, from what I understand, and I appreciate the map that you provided, there does seem to be a bias for large-scale operations in some of the more wealthier farms, and I'm curious to what extent anything is being done to offset that imbalance.
What you all did in the Farm Bill, as well as continuing, that we did, were price caps. The facts of the matter is that the larger farmers farm the probably 50 to 60% of the land and produce about 75 to 80% of the products of the United States.
Would those farmers be profitable but for the trade aid in 2019?
Many of them would not.
Right, but then you said...
Like the bigger you are, the harder you fall.
Understood.
The losses would be more.
But to be clear, you're on record saying that keeping farms in business that aren't profitable is not really the focus, right?
Say again, I'm sorry.
You're on record. I believe you said you're not compelled to keep anyone in business if it's not profitable.
I think, again, we have to recognize that farming is a business, and you have to make a profit. That's what my answer to the question was, the profitability of agriculture.
Totally understand. I'm saying that as you make that decision, it appears you're prioritizing the big farmers over the small farmers who aren't making a profit.
No, I would disagree with that. We're at no bias toward large or small. It's a matter that the fact the larger you are, the more you are eligible for those payments.
That's my time. Thank you.
Gentlelady from Missouri, Ms. Hartzler.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you so much for mentioning the Show Me State in Missouri. I couldn't agree more that it's really important that we trust but verify these trade agreements, and I'm really excited, though, about the potential there and appreciate all the work of the administration and you and your support for helping expand that. One of my colleagues, Representative Conaway, asked a question already that I was going to touch on about gene editing, and I wanted to just I guess, foot stomp what you both have said about how important this is that we get this right and make sure that the United States keeps this innovation capability. I represent the University of Missouri, and you've probably heard of Dr. Randy Prather's research where he has developed a PRRS-resistant pig.
Sure.
And how important that is that we get that through the process where we're able to replicate that and to take advantage of this innovation. And this holdup between the FDA and the USDA is just really critical that we get this moving forward. So do you have any more you want to add on that before I go to another topic?
Well, you mentioned one. I didn't use that example earlier, but just think we've seen the devastation of African swine fever. What if we could
Absolutely.
genetically edit a swine that was resistant to African swine fever? We think there's a huge, once the regulation catches up with the biotechnology here, we think there's a lot of potential out here for making actually food therapeutic, actually medicinal type of food, healthy, safe, nutritious food for our populations.
Oh, that's exciting, especially with the challenges we have with the high cost of prescription drugs and the old way of addressing things. So if we could prevent it just by the food we eat, that's just revolutionary. In the 2018 Farm Bill, I passed the community facilities lending provision to increase the threshold for the community facilities and the water waste programs to a population of 50,000 people to allow more of our small communities to be able to access these funds. Can you tell me if the department has yet made any loan guarantees to the newly eligible communities under this program?
I cannot tell you definitively. I believe that we have. We were anxiously awaiting that expansion there. We had a lot of demand in communities that exceeded the $10,000 and $20,000 20-person population limit, and I would assume that we have. I can't definitively tell you that, but we can get you the number of people and the populations that we've served.
That would be great, and if you could also get me more information about when they can apply with those new communities, that's exciting. That would be great. We had a discussion a little bit with another colleague, G.T. Thompson, about crop insurance and flooding and disasters. Of course, being from Missouri, we had a lot of flooding in the Missouri River. We have a lot of levees that had breaches, and we are not going to be able to get all of those levees repaired by spring planting season. Farmers are making efforts to try to repair them on their own and making some temporary filling of the gaps. But are you aware, is there going to be any flexibility in the crop insurance to allow for partial repair of a levee or something to help give a range of crop insurance products so that perhaps they could afford something and incentivize them at least to plant something in the next couple of weeks?
I'm not aware of anything within the crop insurance realm. I know that through NRCS and the EQIP program and those types of damage programs there that we're trying to address what farmers' needs are in when they're facing those levee breaches.
Okay, well, that's something we need to work on for sure. Renewable fuels, very much a win-win for our country, win for our farmers, win for our consumers, win for America, and win for the environment. And I applaud your goals regarding sustainability, where you're talking about the economic sustainability, environmental sustainability as well. I like also what you've done regarding the ethanol grants, $100 million for the new infrastructure program to help with the E15, E20. I was wondering, can you provide additional information on how you think the biofuel sector can contribute to reducing the environmental footprint that we have in this country?
Well, we believe, I know there's been some data that's out that we believe is inaccurate, but our latest information and research shows that the contribution of ethanol and biofuels obviously lower greenhouse gas emissions and is good for the environment. That was one of the original purposes as far as American-grown fuel as well.
Absolutely. Well, appreciate all your work.
Thank you.
And I yield back.
Thank you very much. Now recognize the gentlelady from Virginia, Ms. Spanberger.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairwoman. Secretary Perdue, ahead of these hearings, I reached out to producers in my district in Central Virginia, and I asked them how they felt that the rural economy is working for them. And resoundingly, the answer that we heard was it's not. Our farmers are continuing to struggle with the loss of market access abroad as a result of our trade war with China. And one of my constituents who I see fairly regularly, a soybean farmer, large family farm, conveyed to me that despite the recent U.S.-China Phase 1 agreement, he had little confidence that the agreement would provide meaningful relief to him and his family. He literally said it was too little, too late. And he felt that all the decades of time and money spent by farmers like him in his community building business relationships and partnerships in China had been thrown away and, as he called it, irreparably harmed. Today, he's finding that the buyers who used to buy his product have developed new relationships in Brazil and Argentina, and they don't seem ready to abandon those. He's afraid that he won't be able to get his business back. So my question is, I understand that USDA may be unable to repair the damage done by this trade war, but as we think about the purchase commitments agreed to in the U.S.-China Phase 1 agreement, what role do you see USDA playing in monitoring China's compliance to ensure that farmers at least have the chance to receive some relief as they work hard to try and rebuild relationships and gain back some market share?
Well, first of all, I'm much more optimistic than your producer there. I think, again, we will regain those markets, and USDA's role is to monitor that. As I said earlier, while you weren't here, we're going to trust but verify. We think these agreements that were signed were hard numbers that are enforceable, unilaterally enforceable, and our role is to provide the administration at USTR, Commerce, and the President with how we're coming on that. What is that data? We have ability to track the shipping data, the export data. Some of it lags sometimes a month, but that's what we'll be doing. And also I mentioned prior to your coming in was that we see good encouraging signs of China doing things underneath from a technical resolution of some of the non-tariff trade barriers that are encouraging. So we're hopeful, we're optimistic. We believe that China is a shrewd consumer. They're going to buy where the best deal is. This time of year, they buy soybeans from Brazil. We think they'll come into this market in late spring and summer and fulfill the commitments, but we'll be looking.
And here, this particular producer I'm talking about is a family farmer who's been farming in one of our counties for decades. His family continues to farm, and he himself is in his late 70s. And I would make the position that my answer to him as his representative in Congress can't be that he needs to be more optimistic, because he is seeing the day-to-day results of this trade war, as are other farmers and producers across our district. And he was talking about this year, as he's filing his taxes, he was troubled by the fact that on his Schedule F, the government payouts he received exceeded the profits that he made. He doesn't want payouts. He said his friends don't want payouts. He wants a fair shot. He wants open markets. He's worked for decades to build up relationships and have the ability to compete internationally. But he's got a growing sense of insecurity and uncertainty. And so I would ask, when we're moving forward, that we please ensure that we have a level of strategy, recognizing that we need a lot more than optimism to help our farmers and producers, particularly our small family farmers.
Ma'am, I think the trade as it develops will create optimism. I didn't indicate that you can suggest your producer become more optimistic. I said I'm more optimistic about that based on what I know. I would really seriously doubt that if he's developed personal relationships of people buying soybeans in China, we've done a great job as an industry. We think that market's going to come back based on what we're seeing already, and I'm more optimistic about that.
And, sir, I'm a former CIA officer. I work in national security. One of the tenets of everything we ever did was contingency plan for the absolute worst case. And so is USDA planning for the absolute worst case if these markets don't come back?
I think that was the essence of the president's tweet, where he said, if the trade does not develop as we expect and hope that it will, then I'm willing to support the farmers with another round of MFP payments. That was a big if. I'm telling farmers, let's plant for the market, hope for the trade, and pray for the trade to come back as we think it will. But if it doesn't, the president's willing to support any kind of trade disruption. I also said that these market facilitation programs are not price support programs. They are market trade disruption programs, and the farmers need to plant for the marketplace.
So, and planning with the if and the tweet that you mentioned, that's, from my perspective, kicking the can down the road. That's not planning for what happens when they don't come back. That's delaying what might be the worst case scenario. I thank you for being here today, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Allen, you recognize.
Thank you. Well, Mr. Secretary, good to see you today, and thank you for coming down to the district and announcing that a grant for $5 million, USDA grant for our broadband in Evans and McIntosh counties. That was a great event. I wished I'd have brought a big heavy coat. Maybe 2 or 3 I could have shared them. At temperature, we were at this event, it dropped from like 48 degrees to 28 degrees during the hour. But anyway, that's a big deal. Thank you for doing that. I'm going to start off with pecans. Obviously, you know, we're a top state in pecan production, and that industry is vital to Georgia and our economy. The pecan farmers have been unfairly targeted by the tariffs in India, and currently there's a 36% Indian tariff on U.S. pecan imports. India does not produce pecans, and we have written the U.S. trade representative on the pecan tariff and discussed with the USTR team, but it would be helpful if you can help assure us that it is on the U.S. list of tariffs to be removed during our trade negotiations with India. And would you consider doing that for us?
I can verify that it was on the list. In fact, Ambassador Lighthizer had presented a list of options to the president, who determined that it was not a big enough kind of deal, and he believes that as he has been successful in the past, using the leverage of his office, there will be a better opportunity for India. You know that India has been a very tough export market for the United States, with very unfair, non-reciprocal trade barriers there. So we hope to have some better news in that market.
Well, and obviously one time I had the presidency here on the whole China thing, and because the Chinese were being so unfair with how they were dealing with us, that I recommended that he go to these other countries, and let's see if we can work with countries, that will promote fair trade. The other big issue in the district is labor, H-2A program, and I constantly hear from producers about the inability to find labor on their farms. Many use the H-2A visa program, and but it's frustrating. It's complex. It costs a lot to participate in the program. And I know that you work diligently with the Department of Labor on regulatory reforms on the H-2A program. Where are we with those reforms, and what are some of the other problems with the H-2A program that you have identified that where Congress needs to get involved and do some type of legislative fix?
Well, labor obviously is really the number one and number two issue with trade all over the country, and it is. I think it's time we separated the immigration issue, where people want to come to a country and become citizens, with an economic labor issue. of where they want to come for economic opportunity to help grow our economy. I think those two have been conflated for too long, and that the challenge has been the people fear that people who want to come on a temporary basis, such as H-2A workers, are looking for immigration, and that's not the case at all. I think, again, the DOL, the labor rules are at OMB waiting to be certified there to be able to put out. It will help to modernize that, but Congressman, the issue really, this adverse wage rate has become a perverse wage rate in agriculture. We essentially have in agriculture, a $15 minimum wage there where we don't anywhere else in the economy.
Yes, sir. And I've got about 54 seconds, so we'll have to make this quick. But you recently traveled to Europe, and of course, as far as trading relationships with European Union, UK, and there are real concerns here in the U.S. on which is a blatant, they say a blatant disregard for science the EU has set in setting their policies. And from your perspective on your trip, what are the biggest sticking points to U.S. trying to negotiate deals with Europe on particularly peanuts and things like that?
Well, the European culture has sort of denigrated American food as unsafe. We're giving them the facts based on sound science about that. They talk about chlorinated chicken. We really don't do that at all. We use other products there, and our food safety record is better. How do you change the mind of people who have an opinion? It's almost like an ideology or religion, but we're continuing to use sound science, and I think the future is better for the UK. We're looking forward to going and having a free reciprocal trade with the UK once they're out of the EU, which then I think will facilitate better relationships with the EU.
Thank you for your service, sir. I yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to recognize now the gentleman from California, Mr. Cox. You're recognized.
Secretary Perdue, thank you so much for being here today, and certainly thank you so much for making it out to the Central Valley of California. You were always welcome there. And on a particular note, I really want to say thank you, and I appreciated your willingness to work with me to implement the needed changes to the Pima Cotton Competitiveness Program, which is providing much needed relief and support to the Pima cotton producers, certainly in my district. But in the last couple of days, we've been hearing about staffing shortages at the county FSA offices across the country, and certainly my district is no exception. And my staff has been working with local farmers unable to be able to access the critical farm programs. And certainly the lack of staff at these offices is consistently being brought up as a reason for the delay in service and payments. And I have frankly grown very concerned since my time here in Congress with the decline in staff morale at the USDA, the relocation of core offices, and reports of understaffing at the core USDA mission areas. And so, given the expressed commitment to excellent customer service, I mean, I'd like to hear what you plan to do to ensure USDA is fulfilling these crucial positions and is seen as a desirable place to work.
Very good question, and I want to commit to you. We want to hear from you when you have service level problems within any district here from any member. This has been a very frustrating situation for us. The unemployment rate of 3.5%, I never thought we'd have as much difficulty hiring people to the federal government as we have. And it's not because of a lack of effort. It's a very onerous onboarding process. We've been given some direct hiring authority, which enables us to do a quicker onboarding job, and we hope to fulfill that. But I can tell you, this has been a very, I mean, we talk about it almost every week. It's been a very frustrating problem trying to find through the federal system workers to come in into there. We find that when they apply nationally, they don't want to move to a particular area. Whether they apply from California, they don't want to go to the east or vice versa. So the local hiring authority will enable us to help fulfill these sooner.
All right. And more in a global sense, we've got an administration, certainly when they first came to office, one of the first things they did was implement a hiring freeze. And then they've issued a directive about reducing the size of the government workforce, the federal workforce, through attrition. And so that seems to be at odds with the intent to hire more people at the FSA or the USDA. And so how does that reconcile?
I've had no such directions at USDA. We've got hiring levels. We have had some funding issues, frankly, on the FSA issue. So some of the budget issues that were addressed last year and in this budget recommended will help. But we had some limitations. NRCS has been more of a difficulty finding people, but there were some budget cap issues on the hiring process that it slowed us down on the FSA people.
Well, so just to be clear, is that the agency reform plan, which was supposed to detail workforce reductions through attrition, that's not something that the USDA is looking at or implementing?
No, we have a hiring plan that continues to move, and as I said, one of our principles is customer service. You have to have the people to do that.
All right, and so I guess just in a general sense, USDA, we want more employees. We'd like to grow that workforce.
We want enough people to get the job done. I don't want more or less. I want enough people to get the job done. That's what our optimum
And right now, we
office-
don't have enough, though.
We're not having enough in some places. We've got an optimum office production that tells where the workload is and who needs to be there.
And do we have metrics from that optimum office yet to detail how well that's working?
We do.
Oh, yeah, that'd be great to see. No, thanks very much. And I want to reiterate what Congressman Costa was saying, which is trade is so vitally important to my district. And, you know, the Phase 2 trade deal with Japan is just such a promising market, especially for the specialty crop sector. And so can you just expand once again on what the USDA is doing to help and open and expand those markets?
Well,
Last
certainly
20 seconds.
In Japan, obviously, which is a good destination from your state of California there, and $7 billion more in agriculture, many of the products and almonds and other products of the variety of products you all grow there is going to be beneficial. We're also the Korea market, the Korea agreement on rice for your California premium rice is also a big benefit in the Korea agreement.
Great. Thanks so much, Secretary. Always great to see you.
Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Boss, you recognize.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Secretary Perdue, first off, thank you for what you've done with the agency and also for being in our own district and mine and Rodney Davis's over the times you've been there. Also want to thank the administrator of the RMA, Marty Barber, for his work with FAC and in FAC issues that affect double-cropped soybean growers. It was an issue last year. We were able to work through it, and I think the insurance agents now can move with more clarity on how to better serve their clients with that double crop. But last year, 3 different WASDE crop reports sent the markets tumbling through because of the inflated claims of acres planted for corn and soybeans. Can you explain NASA's process behind the reports, and additionally, why was WASDE report exist if the FSA already has the report number of acres for each crop?
There are 2 different reporting schemes. One lags another. The FSA reports acres by what farmers come into it. NAS has a consistent protocol of assessment over acres going forward. One of the issues with the farmer complaints last year is that one of the reports in the middle of the summer last year, the market was, expectations were far off from what NAS had developed, and it caused the prices to go down because of the expectation with the wet weather, wet spring, and prevented plants. At the end of the day, Congressman, NAS got it better than the market did. And that's the end of the story there, is that we can't control what the market expects there and what they trade on. And when the market goes down, because when they see the NAS numbers, they realize they may have been too optimistic, and that's what happens.
Well, thank you for that. I want to go back to where there was a statement made earlier, and I want to let you know what somebody brought up, how their farmers were feeling in their district. Let me tell you how my farmers were feeling in my district. As this trade thing started with China, here's what they told me early on, and you and I had this conversation. They told me that they believed that it had been a long time coming with China, and that trade negotiation had to occur. They didn't want it to last too long. They wanted to get through it as fast as possible. I believe one of the problems, and they do too, was the fact that the trade negotiations on the USMCA was actually, because it took so long for it to move through this House, being held up by leadership, that it actually gave the President and the administration trouble in negotiating the China deal, and that's what slowed that deal down, and that's what caused a lot of the problems in the market at that time. It's also what caused the purchase of, and China to make their deal with South America, which caused the markets to do what they did. I think it's kind of amazing when we sit in these rooms and we watch, and how somebody, if you just say something long enough that isn't true, it automatically becomes true. So I want to thank you for what you do in your office and what we've been doing. The concerns that we have every day with the markets is because we know that farmers work off of each year. They're worried about too much rain, not enough rain, what are the markets going to do, and the concerns they have. It's natural in being in agriculture that you have a fear. That's life. That's what it is in ag. But I'm going to tell you this. I don't know about the other members here that were asking questions, but I can tell you this. Our farmers know that we're trying to do everything we can for them, and I think the administration is doing that, and I think they're very happy with that. And I think the trade deals are going to help tremendously with the farmers, and I think it's looking very, very positive from here on out, and I thank you for being here today, and I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Gentlelady from Minnesota, Ms. Craig.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretary Perdue, for appearing before the committee this morning. As we've heard from a few of my colleagues, and especially in districts like mine, where we've got just a ton of family farmers, it's no secret that the trade policies of the last few years have put Minnesota farmers in a little bit of turmoil here. The market facilitation program certainly kept farmers afloat, but I'm concerned that we've set a terrible precedent for U.S. farm policy. This committee has spent decades working toward a farm safety net that's predictable and reliable. At the agency's Ag Outlook Forum, you said regarding another round of MFP, I would not anticipate it. Farmers have got to farm for the market and what it's telling them and what their capabilities are from a production perspective. The next day, the President tweeted that additional MFP payments are possible until the new trade deals kick in. You know, I spent 25 years working in business before I came here last year, and this kind of policy making, it's not predictable, it's not reliable, it's no way to make farmers run their businesses, and given that farm debt is increasing twice as fast as farm equity, how can their lenders ignore such a statement from the President? Should I take your comments here and this morning to mean that you're advising the President against the release of another round of MFP, which, by the way, I strongly supported the previous rounds? And can you comment on why the President tweeted about the possibility of more ad hoc MFP payments in the same month that he proposed a budget that would gut federal crop insurance, which is, of course, one of the most predictable and market-based risk management options available to farmers?
Certainly. I would stand by my statement that if the President asked me today and we communicate on a regular basis, is that I would not recommend another market facilitation program. His tweet, as I understand it, and I read it, was preceded by the preposition if, which means a contingency there. If this trade that we expect does not materialize, he is prepared again to help people, farmers, move through this. We've already heard today that it's been critical for their bottom lines to be able to continue. Lenders, I think, have to look at the market, look at the production plans that their producers come in. It's tough out there, but it's going to be challenging. I think, again, I've expressed optimism that the trade will develop, but if it does not, I believe that the President will do what he said he will do.
Well, I'd just like to respond to that, and then I'll move on to my next question. Good farm policy should be focused on good economics, not political expediency. And this is exactly the problem, Mr. Secretary, is what about that is a predictable farm safety net, and how are small and beginning farmers supposed to plan with comments like that? So with that, I'll leave it to you to figure out how we decreased his use of Twitter. I'd like to now shift to beginning farmers. For more than a decade, the Main Street Project outside of Northfield, Minnesota, where I represent, has trained rural Latino immigrants on regenerative ag practices in poultry as a means out of poverty. This is Janet. She's just one of the beginning farmers who has taken part in training through the Main Street Project. In August, the project was informed that they've been awarded a U.S. NIFA Beginning Farmer and Rancher grant. Those grant funds were publicly announced in October, but as of today, the organization still does not have the funds they were promised by USDA. You said the move of ERS NIFA to Kansas City was to better serve farmers and ranchers where they are, but that just hasn't proven to be the case for farmers like Janet. So following relocation, the Office of Grants and Financial Management only has 26 positions filled out of the 95 total permanent positions. So what impact has this had on the agency's ability to get money out the door?
I can tell you what I've been told by NIFA is that the money is getting out of the door. I'd love to hear about this specific one. I will absolutely respond back about where that grant is, but I'm being told that deliverables are on schedule in that way. We are continuing to hire there while we extended some people here in order to deliver the services. We were committed to that services would not suffer, and if this is a broad-based issue, then I'll be back, but we'll specifically
Thank you.
talk about this one.
We've been in touch with USDA, but it shouldn't take a member of Congress to get those dollars to the folks they've been awarded
Absolutely.
to. So
I agree.
thank you again, Mr. Secretary, and I yield back.
Thank you.
Thanks, gentlelady. Gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Rosler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I noted the conversation a little earlier about big operators versus small operators and so forth, and I think it's important for the record to point out the bigger you are, the bigger your note at the bank. A lot of people forget that. It's not like your margins get so much greater the bigger you get. The margins are small, so you have to get big in order to make it all work. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here. You're doing a great job, and I really appreciate all the work that you and your team are putting in. I have a constituent back home that has a unique situation. He's not eligible for WIP, not eligible for NAP. We had Hurricane Florence come through in 2018. Totally wiped him out, about $1 million loss for him. Produces native warm season grass seed and wildflower seed, and a lot of that is used in our conservation, CRP, et cetera. And I know you and Commissioner Troxler have been in consultation about the block grant, to the states and trying to work out some agreement there. This is a very unique situation. I'm sure this gentleman's not the only one who finds himself uneligible for NAP and not eligible for WIP. I'd like for you guys to, in your department, to take a good look at his situation, okay, if you don't mind. And if it's possible to get something worked out with Commissioner Troxler on that front. I know the commissioner's team are very much aware of this individual and his particular situation. And it's important to me that we exhaust all angles to see if we can help them out.
Sure. We'd rather be a negotiation rather than a confrontation.
Well, absolutely. Absolutely. And I know y'all are going back and forth, so I'd categorize it as a negotiation. And like I said, I know the commissioners folks are well aware of this particular situation as well. Second point, the vaccine bank for FMD, there are a number of us on this committee that have an interest in that and the implementation of that. I was just curious where that stands.
Yes, I think Undersecretary Ibaugh has, I think he issued requests for information over people interested in proposals in doing that. That was the third leg of the stool, along with the overall early detection through, we've already put money out into the labs across the country, and then an early detection and biosecurity network of awareness and training. The foot and mouth vaccine is where we're getting information about how that can be done. You know, there's some limitations here on the mainland of handling that virus, so we have to take those in consideration. And if our NBAF facility were up in Kansas, then we could do it there, but we have to be extremely careful in how that's handled. So we're in the midst of taking requests for information now about proposals of what they think they could do in that regard.
Moving on to trade, we've got a great opportunity, I think, with the UK to put together a really, really good trade deal that I think if we can do will substantially help us in negotiation with the EU later on. You have any comments on where we are with the UK and the possibility there and what that would mean for American agriculture?
I think the relationship, both heritage and otherwise, I believe it will be a good opportunity for the United States to do a trade deal with the UK. We know that they're constrained until the end of the year, but we're preparing. I'll be visiting there in a couple of weeks and making our case over our products from a reciprocal basis in that way. And we're hopeful that we can get something done with the UK, which we think will lead to better relationships with the EU. But we see an anxiousness of a willingness for the UK to trade in a method that's not constrained by some of the EU rules.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a great opportunity for us, and I think to the degree we're successful with that will really help us with the EU. That's my read on it, and let us know how we can be helpful in that process. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you.
Well, thanks, gentlemen. Gentlelady from North Carolina, Ms. Adams.
Thank you very much, Chairman Peterson, Ranking Member, for hosting the session. Mr. Secretary, it's good to see you again.
Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to ask a couple of questions about the impacts of the ERS and NIFA relocation and the impact that it's having on 1890 land-grant universities. All 19 schools turned in their applications last November for the 1890 scholarships, which received $40 million in mandatory funding in the 2018 Farm Bill. But it's been 3 months. They still haven't received the funding. They're concerned that the money, which is somewhere in the neighborhood of $750,000 per school, may not be available until late this spring for students entering school in the fall. Having been a professor for 40 years, I know that schools need to be able to notify students early, that late spring about their scholarships, so that their recruiting can make informed decisions. So given that about 68% of NIFA's positions are vacant, what is USDA doing to ensure this delayed funding doesn't prevent students from studying agriculture at one of our 1890s?
First of all, Ms. Adams, I'm very disappointed to hear that report because it conflicts with what my people at NIFA have told me regarding that, particularly in the HBCUs. Regarding the student scholarships there, as I indicated in my earlier comments, it's my understanding that these are being disseminated, and I will specifically find out if your facts are accurate. Then I'm extremely disappointed in the information I'm being given about that. Our commitment in this move was that the services would not be inhibited, and that's my expectation. In that way, we allowed some extensions in order to make sure that the services were continued.
Okay, great. Well, I hope you do look into that. That is the information that I have. So you do have a timeline already for dispersing the funding?
Yes, ma'am. We actually prioritized those HBCU scholarships because they were new, and we know that the students were looking forward to them. So as I said, I will check on that, and if your facts are accurate, then I'm very disappointed in the information I've been given.
Okay, if you get back to me, I appreciate it. So let me also ask about an update on how the implementation is going on the Centers of Excellence, which I did fight for along with some of my colleagues in the 2018 bill. I've heard that the department is moving slowly on getting the money out for fiscal year 2019, an appropriation of about $5 million of the centers. So another $6 million was appropriated for these centers, and we really need to get this money out. So I'm concerned again about the lack of staff for the 1890s program and NIFA due to the move to Kansas, and which it has contributed to this delay, we think. So how is USDA working to fill the gaps, first of all, during the transition, to ensure that the work to support the 1890s is taking place?
It's my understanding that these consortiums of these centers of excellence are being processed in that way over their applications of what they want to do. Adams, I don't know how many I've visited, but I'm very, I don't hear these things when I'm on campus there from the presidents. And I've been to several HBCUs, and we try to be very open about any kind of issues they're facing. And I don't hear those. If they're contacting you, there must be an issue, but I wish they'd contact me as well.
Okay. Well, I strongly supported the inclusion of the Office of Urban Agriculture and Innovative Production in the Farm Bill, push for the funding. One of the provisions in the bill provided $10 million in mandatory money through the Commodity Credit Corporation. So I would expect that with funding already available for use, that those grants would be implemented expeditiously, so I'm glad that you're going to look into it. Do you have any updates on the implementation of the competitive grants and of the office itself?
Yes, ma'am. I can't give you the definitive definition. I remember our staff mentioning that to me about where we were on it, but I'd rather, since I can't be sure about it, I'd rather tell you in a response in a QFR over where we are on those competitive grants.
Okay, just one comment, I just have a few seconds, but, you know, we're still concerned about the SNAP funding. It's really having an impact in my district. It certainly will be in terms of some of the rules, and I think I mentioned those to you last time we had breakfast. But
Yes, ma'am.
So if you could give me a little update on it or send the information to me.
Yes, if I can respond to some of the SNAP concerns here. We're issuing waivers as we speak here on really in 18 states, again, on the waivers that do qualify based on the new rules, 186 labor market areas in 18 states. We'd have to look if yours are eligible in there and qualify for that, but people are applying for wages or for waivers, and we're continuing to do that under the new rules that we've put out.
Thank you, sir. I'm out of time. Chair, I'll yield back.
Thank you, gentlelady. Gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Abram.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I know we don't have a language barrier between the great people of Georgia and the great people of Louisiana, and I might argue the rest of the state, but my good friend Rick Allen called them pecans. We call them pecans in Louisiana. So just to get that straight on the record. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here. As you know, you're a rock star in the agricultural community. We appreciate all you've done. And if I could add to your comments about farming, I think if we take out our soldiers, our men and women in uniform that defend our country most admirably, that farming probably is the toughest and most volatile profession that we have in this country. It's one bad weather storm, and they are in a very precarious position. Your opening statement alluded to the high-speed broadband. We all know here how critical that is for just everything, just life, now in America and in the global world, the global economy. And thank you for your work. Thanks to your work, we got $15 million in Louisiana for deployment of high-speed broadband. My question is, moving forward, what can we as Congress do to help with more deployment of high-speed broadband, and how can we get more companies to buy into the federal program? They are already set up to deploy. They've got the technology. We just need them to get in the game. So what can we do?
I think one of the things you all already did was to loosen up some of the definition of unserved, underserved, whereby recently we know there's a real issue with the maps where you see that. Helping us with more definition. I know the FCC is working on that, but if one house in a census tract had service, it was declared as served.
Exactly right.
And the most of it was not. So that's been cured. I think, again, I would ask you and your colleagues to look at how we're deploying this money that you've given us, this first $600 million, the other $1.1 billion. And if you like that methodology of what we're doing, let's continue in broadening that out from rural development. I think it's been well received, and we'd love to continue to do more of it. It's needed, as you know. The problem is it's a long way from being everywhere.
And about the companies, these big global, these national companies that have the technology in place, they've already got high-speed broadband, they've got that infrastructure in place. How can we get them more involved in some of these projects?
As you know, the concern about being duplication or overbuilt, that's probably going to take some congressional action with the carriers or the major carriers there. We got a lot of dark fiber out there that we don't know where it is and not being utilized. And they used federal money before to put that dark fiber in there, but it hadn't been turned on. So I think some investigation through appropriate agencies and with congressional impetus there could help that coordination.
Well, thank you. And just a quick add-on, my farmers, certainly in my district and all over Louisiana that I've talked to, and it's been many, they're very optimistic with the trade, that's the deals that are going on with China. So I think there's good times ahead. Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
Thanks, gentlemen. Gentlelady from Washington, Ms. Schreier.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. I, first of all, wanted to echo Mr. Allen's comments about the struggles of H-2A visas and what an economic challenge that poses to our farmers in the Northwest. I also wanted to make you aware, if you are not already aware, that there is an excellent bipartisan bill with several members of this committee called the Farm Workforce Modernization Act that does several really good things for our farmers that people on both sides of the aisle agree on. It streamlines the H-2A visa process. It puts controls on the inflation of wages, and it also has a path to citizenship for people who are working in ag and commit to continuing to work in ag. And so if you could whisper in the president's ear about that bill, I would love to see, and I think a lot of people in this room would love to see that move forward.
We're very aware.
That didn't sound reassuring. My second comment was about something called little cherry disease. In Washington state, apples and cherries are among the state's top 15 exports. So protecting and strengthening the tree fruit industry is critical for our economy. In this past cherry season, it became apparent that the Pacific Northwest cherry growers are facing a substantial threat from little cherry disease. It's caused by viruses that are either transmitted by insects or that are transmitted through root systems. And so the only treatment for this, once it's detected, is to pull the trees out. And that is a significant economic threat. So this has reached epidemic proportions in Washington state, and growers are scrambling to obtain new tools to detect and treat this and stop the spread. I am aware of a tree fruit entomologist position at the Wapato ARS laboratory that remains vacant after the retirement of the scientists in July of 2019. And it's my understanding that ARS has not been able to fill this position due to insufficient funding. In addition to this, I'm aware of at least 2 other positions at the same laboratory that remain vacant. And I know you talked, when Mr. Cox asked, about staffing and whether we had sufficient staffing. And clearly in this part of my district and in my state, we do not have sufficient staffing for excellent work between Washington State University and ARS. So this is not a question. It's really more to just bring to your attention how important it is that the ARS labs, specifically the one in Wapato, be fully staffed in order to manage this vector and protect our economy. The second issue that I wanted to talk about, if I do have a moment, is herbicide resistance. This is becoming an increasing problem across the country. And because herbicides are not working, tillage will now probably increase as the most economical alternative control measure. The problem is that this goes against all the modern science with soil health. It increases wind and water erosion. It also releases more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and compromises soil health, and will probably also compromise water quality in the Snake River and Columbia rivers. Washington farmers all want to do the right thing. They want to conserve soil. They want to have healthy soil. They want to pass this on to the next generation, and they need help. And I wondered, how is the USDA addressing regionally specific problems associated with herbicide resistance and soil conservation, and what do you need from us to help that happen?
We need obviously less tillage, more rather than more tillage, as you said. The USDA certainly works closely with the registration partner EPA in making sure these new developments of biotechnology are available as plants and weeds and become resistant to other types of things. So it's mostly an interagency regulatory issue of moving forward. We're working with the Department of Interior. Fish and Wildlife has to issue a biological opinion. National Marine Fisheries has to issue a biological opinion on new products. We're encouraging them to use the same set of facts and data over this in order to move these along more expeditiously. As things become resistant, we don't want the answer to be more tillage and more plowing. We want it to be more no-till and using these safe products to control the problem.
Thank you for your comments. I'm running out of time, but I think this calls into question, just like there's understaffing at the USDA, the issue of losing scientists at the EPA who could really help us solve these problems as well. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, gentlelady. Gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Homer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Secretary, it's great to have you back to the Ag Committee. I'm a big fan, and you're doing a great job, and you're very popular with everyone in the agriculture community. I want to thank you also for your commitment to broadband. That's one of the biggest issues in my rural district in Kentucky is lack of access to broadband. I know that we had 3 communities in my congressional district that were rewarded with the first round of Reconnect money. And I was wondering if you could kind of give us an update on how round 2 is going to take place and what can we do to get more participation in that program.
All 3 areas, well, the 3 areas of the $600 million you gave us initially, we had 200 in grants, 200 in loan grant, and 200 in loans. They all 3 were oversubscribed. We began our second round of applications this January. I think it closes on the 16th of March, and we expect oversubscription in those as well, based on the popularity there. So as long as that continues to take place, we'll probably perpetuate the program the way it goes on. And as I indicated earlier, I hope you all will give us feedback about whether there could be improvements or better, and Congressman Abraham did to some degree. So we look forward to hearing from you.
Well, I appreciate that, and I'm sure you'll get more applications from Kentucky, and you'll be hearing from our office. But again, thank you for that first round. Next, I wanted to talk about hemp. You know, we've had conversations with hemp, and I've had numerous conversations with your great undersecretaries that I've worked with in the past on this issue. I want to thank you, first of all, for the recent USDA announcement to delay the enforcement of the requirements for labs to be registered by the DEA. That was something I put in my letter of request to you, and I appreciate you doing that. That was a big issue in Kentucky. But, you know, I've always been a huge proponent of hemp, and I will continue to be. I believe in hemp. I believe there's a tremendous future for hemp. When I was advocating for hemp, when I was Commissioner of Agriculture, I was thinking about fiber.
Right.
And what's happened, especially in Kentucky and many other states, is the CBD oil market has kind of taken over. And I'm a farmer, I can say this. In agriculture, we're very good at overproducing things sometimes. Hemp was grossly overproduced in Kentucky and many other states this year. I know that language was put in the Farm Bill for hemp crop insurance. I'm not a fan of that. I fear that will lead to more overproduction and potential fraud, and I just wanted to publicly say I had some concerns about that, and hopefully that the final end product will be one that will not encourage overproduction. That I know the requirement that I had requested, one of the requirements for crop insurance that I had mentioned in a previous committee hearing to Bill Northey was, I hope that it said you had to have a contract with a processor before you could get crop insurance to prevent fraud. And that's in the language the way I understand it. But hopefully there's some awareness of the fact that there are credible hemp companies in America, and there are some that aren't credible. We've had several in Kentucky file bankruptcy that have left the farmers hanging with a surplus crop of hemp. So these are concerns that I have moving forward. I've shared that with many people in USDA. I appreciate the good work that you're doing. I know that this is a very challenging thing for the USDA to have to administer, but I appreciate the work that you've done thus far, and I look forward to working with you on that issue in the future. Now, with respect to trade, I was just wondering if you could kind of give me a brief update of how things are going. I know that we've had the Phase 1 agreement with China. Are they fulfilling their agreement thus far in purchasing the products, the commodities that they pledged to produce?
The coronavirus has clouded somewhat.
Right.
Obviously, just from a physical perspective of things backing up at the port. The counter-cyclical part of their buying, typically when South America's harvesting, that's when they go there. So those are some of the considerations. The bright spot that I mentioned a couple of times before this morning is that we see the technical things that need to happen in order to facilitate the kind of trade is happening. The technicians there, and that's where a lot of those little nicky non-trade tariff barriers there that China has used to push back are being torn down. I take a lot of optimism from that they're trying to fulfill their obligation that they agreed to on those numbers.
Yeah. Well, my time's run out, Mr. Secretary. On behalf of Kentucky farmers, I want to thank you for your commitment to helping make sure that farmers are a priority in this trade agreement with China. Our agriculture community in Kentucky appreciates you and appreciates the President.
Well,
thank you.
Hemp is tricky. We need your help.
Thanks, gentlemen. Gentleman from California, Mr. Carbajal.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Secretary Perdue. I've always appreciated your candor and your straightforwardness of dealing with the issues at hand. I want to start out by just expressing my great disappointment in this administration with the proposed $182 billion cut from the SNAP program over the next decade, and the implications that has for so many food insecure families, vulnerable families throughout our country and in my district. In my district alone, I have 111,000 individuals that rely on these important programs. And quite frankly, I think it's not only callous, but I think it's extremely misguided. And I would be remiss if I didn't share with you my outrage with the direction this administration is going in regards to the SNAP program, violating the spirit of compromise that we reached on the 2018 Farm Bill, which dealt with a lot of these issues already. But here we are again. The president didn't get his way, and he's just continuing to just go after the most vulnerable. So please know that I'm extremely disappointed, as many people are. But with that, let me move on to other issues. Earlier, one of my colleagues mentioned the Farm Workforce Modernization Act, which is a bipartisan product that I think lends itself to a lot of potential. And I know you mentioned you were aware of it, but I'm just wondering, what is the administration, what are we doing to move that forward if it's such a reasonably decent piece of legislation and bipartisan?
Mention the program again, the farm, which program?
Oh, no, that was the legislation is the second one I'm speaking about. The first one was SNAP.
Yes.
But the bill that passed the House in a bipartisan fashion, the Farm Workforce Modernization Act.
Okay. Certainly, labor is a big issue, and we've been visiting with the other House here in the Senate to talk about the provisions there that could be included in that as the way any legislation passes in that regard. It's very needed. We need a legal, reliable workforce, as I indicated earlier. we need in this country to differentiate between immigration, which is one thing, and a legal, reliable, temporary workforce in agriculture.
Absolutely, and that's what that legislation would do. So I would hope that the administration is working with our friends in the Senate and trying to get them to really try to find that compromise so we could move forward with this legislation. Secondly, specialty crops grown on the Central Coast, which is in California in my district, are important to our local economy. These high-value crops such as wine grapes, citrus, and are vulnerable to pests and diseases. And USDA and the state of California have historically been strong partners in protecting these crops. That is why, again, I was disappointed to see the proposed cuts to the critical APHIS program in the fiscal year 21 President's budget request, including an $8.9 million reduction in spending to combat specialty crop pests. Just last month, APHIS and CDFA expanded the quarantine zone for citrus greening in my state. We've seen the impact this disease can have on states like Florida, yet the president did not ask for additional resources to fight this disease in his budget. Additionally, the president's budget proposes reducing spending on pests such as the glossy-winged sharpshooter, European grapevine moth, and the light brown apple moth, all of which threaten Santa Barbara County and San Luis Obispo County agriculture production, which are the largest economic drivers in my district. How would these proposed reductions in spending impact USDA's ability to protect California's crop farmers from devastating pests and diseases?
Well, USDA and APHIS particularly understand the potential for pest destruction of industries. You mentioned the citrus industry and earthers, and I can assure you that they are using any money that's given appropriated to them in order to just to protect the crops in your area. As across the country, we've got other issues in Pennsylvania and the lanternfly and all those issues that are continued pests coming in, and we'll do the very best we can.
Thank you. And looping back to my initial question on SNAP, is California listed on the waiver list that you mentioned earlier?
Let me see if, I think there are several waivers in California. Yes, sir, there's 17 areas, labor market areas waived in California.
Are any of those San Luis Obispo and Santa Barbara County?
I think so.
Is that a think so or a yes?
I can't say for sure. I believe that you're listed on part of the area. I don't know what those 17 areas are specifically, but we have 17 labor market areas in California that waivers are issued.
Great. If we could loop back later on and connect, that would be great. Thank you, Secretary Perdue. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Marshall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me also add my welcome, Mr. Secretary, for being here. I get started, I think, by spending my 5 minutes saying thanks for so many things from my producers back home. Maybe start off with just the speed and efficiency your department carried out the MFP payments. You asked your workers to do more with less over the past several years, so thank you for your help there. A special thanks for your continued leadership to support the ethanol and biodiesel industry as well. This is important not only to agriculture, but also the rural communities. And so many of these communities, the same folks that are working in that ethanol biofuels industry are the same folks that are leading the Rotary Clubs, that are leading United Way fundraising, so that it means so much more than just the jobs there at those plants. So thank you. In your comments, you mentioned the Higher Blends Infrastructure Incentive Program that provides over $100 million in grants to better enable market adaptation for higher blends of ethanol and biodiesel by investing in infrastructure. And we look forward to just what your vision looks like with that, and maybe you could briefly just share what your vision is going forward with some of those plans.
I think our effort would be to make E15 the kind of the law of the land regarding that. That's a 50% increase in demand of a sound, environmentally healthy and safe fuel that would would be utilized, and that's why the infrastructure program is there to help build out the consumer's opportunity to purchase this. We think with better environmental footprint and less cost, and consumers will rapidly adopt that if they have access to it.
Sounds great. So thanks for your efforts, and we look forward to working with you on that. Next, if I could talk a little bit about one of my favorite subjects, NBAT, the National Bio-Agro Defense Facility located in beautiful Manhattan, Kansas, home of Kansas State University. And just thanks so much for your personal interest in touring that facility with me. And as you know, that I'm working with our senior senator, the tight end coach also for the Kansas State Fighting Wildcats, Chairman Pat Roberts. And he and I are working on legislation that would codify the mission and transfer the facility to USDA. How would you envision future partnerships on research with other federal agencies shaping up at the facility?
Congressman, I hope you feel, as I do, that I believe that transition is going very well from DHS. While that facility was initially put under Department of Homeland Security, it really fits more with our scientists and protectionists there that were working at Plum Island to do many of those very dangerous types of things, of dangerous diseases. So we think the interagency process is going well. The relationship that was described and outlined to you and your Kansas colleagues over the transition of who does what, we think is going very well. I hope you found that to be the case.
Absolutely, and was just there recently in the past month, meeting more and more of the professors, the researchers, people moving from Plum Island, finding how welcoming Manhattan, Kansas is. So I agree it's going well. And given your response, I'd also like to get your thoughts on codifying those relationships through legislation here in Congress.
Well, again, I think while we will implement that, I think I would just leave that up to the determination of Congress. If you think those relationships and responsibilities need to be codified, then I certainly would have no objection to that.
Okay, thank you, and I think I have time for one more question here. I'd like to talk about beef for a second. Getting a few phone calls and concerns back home. Under the Federal Meat Inspection Act and corresponding FSIS regulation, no meat product label may bear any false or misleading statement of origin or quality. However, it's my understanding that current FSIS policy allows imported beef products to be generically labeled as products of the USA as long as these products undergo minimal processing or repackaging in USDA FSIS inspected facilities. Mr. Secretary, do you agree that current policy has the potential to mislead consumers? And if so, how do you intend to address this issue in a way that does not violate current agreements with our North American trading partners?
I would agree with that, and certainly you are aware of the overall cool dispute that was negotiated and litigated at WTO. We have to be very careful. We're under consideration right now of how we can give transparency and information to the consumer that doesn't violate that, and we think there's a middle ground that we think is an appropriate label that looks at like processed and slaughtered and processed in the United States. I don't think meat that just comes in and maybe just cut up and packaged from somewhere else ought to be product of the U.S. I think that's another definition. We do feel like we would probably be treading on very difficult ground if we, as some people have in the cattle industry, want born, slaughtered, and processed. We think we'd be, again, taken back to WTO court. And the problem is they've got that $1 billion judgment hanging over us that has not been suspended. And if we did that, I think we'd be vulnerable to that.
Mr. Chairman, can I have 30 more seconds? Mr. Secretary, at the end of the day, this issue is about truth in labeling, and I'm pleased to hear that this is something USDA is working to address. However, I'm concerned against any reforms that would ultimately preserve this or any other minimally informative origin labeling claim. There's a growing desire from consumers for more accurate information about the foods they purchase, and I can assure there's broad bipartisan support here on Capitol Hill for USDA to update these regulations in a meaningful way.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman from Florida, Mr. Lawson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Governor, Secretary, welcome to the one of the things I wanted to respond to is there was some question about the scholarship program for HBCUs, and my dean is here from Florida A&M University, Dr. Taylor. You stand up there, let him see you. And we discussed this yesterday. They're very well pleased with the way things are going, and in order to provide scholarship, and also stated that they are recruiting high-quality students for this program, which is going to be very, very successful to university. The next time you in Tallahassee, I'm going to make sure you get some of the best peach cobbler that we have there.
Again.
Okay. One of the things I wanted to discuss with you, comment on, is that USDA hemp total testing requires requirement to test for 3%. THC making it difficult for new hemp crops to pass the test. States have to follow up with USDA rules. It's a big problem nationally, and I am sure that you all are aware of it. Are they going to try to fix some of this? Florida growers will be able to submit an application for the cultivation permit within 20 days. The Florida Department of Agriculture is expecting 3,000 applications. It could be a big business in Florida, but testing requirement is making it a little challenging.
That's no doubt that is. Well, there's been some relaxation recently. I'm not sure if your comments reflect what we've done on the lab testing in the last few days. This interim final rule, we didn't get it nailed right in the bullseye, and we've tried to make some corrections there. And OMB has allowed us to do that. Frankly, the testing and the limitations and had a lot of impact from DEA and interagency, and they were not excited about the crop as a whole anyway, and we had some pretty serious constraints. So we're trying to address the lab issue, which was a real limitation.
Okay, thank you. You know, in 2019, this ASTA supplement package established a historic timber block grant program that was advocated here in a bipartisan manner. About $380.9 million is set aside for Florida. U.S. currently is at a standstill with states agencies about acreage payment to timber producers. Mr. Secretary, my first question is simply, does USDA have an issue with state agencies using the full amount of block grants funds to advocate for them so that they can provide adequate acreage payment to the timber producers?
This was, again, the balance, Mr. Lawson, and where we're trying to limit the larger landowners. We did that in citrus, as you know. It worked very well there. I think we're really close to negotiation agreement with Florida over that. They wanted, I think, initially 10,000 acres, then 5,000 acres, which would be very large payments that we didn't feel like would represent the will of Congress in that disaster block grant.
Right. And lastly, what benefit does returning useful block grant funds serve for struggling farmers because of the acreage cap, as you talked about? Where would the rest of the money go if they return that money?
Comes back to the Treasury.
Okay, all right. I look forward to working with the department and the state officials to make sure that the farmers are receiving their critical disaster assistance funds, you know, stemming from Michael.
If I may, in this time allowed, give the difficulty there. These are estimates. These damage are estimates there. They're not registries. They're estimates there. And the challenge is we estimate and give that amount that's estimated, and if it doesn't live up to that based on other things, I think there's been a desire to think of the money being granted to be able to do whatever they want to with. Our position at USDA is to meet the need of the disaster, but then if estimate doesn't reach what was estimated, the need doesn't reach what was estimated, then the money should be returned. That's where the real challenge comes in.
Okay, thank you. And at the conclusion, my time about to run out. I'm sure my dean would like to say hello to you.
We'll do that.
And let you know how things are going.
I want to hear how his students are doing.
All right, that's great. Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman from Florida. I now yield 5 minutes to my good friend, Mr. Dunn from Florida. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Perdue, I want to thank you for providing the agricultural community with the certainty of your updated regulatory approach to the gene-edited crops under your leadership. USDA was the very first to implement President Trump's executive order on a regulatory framework for agricultural biotech products. You've set the bar for the way we ought to regulate these innovative tools, and I hope that the FDA and EPA will follow your lead. Given what's at stake, can you comment on the regulatory burdens that still hurt farmers, foresters, and ranchers, and where can we help you, especially as regards biotech?
I think the good news is, from what I've seen, is Secretary Bernhardt at Interior has Fish and Wildlife basing on their biological opinions on sound science. We still have some challenges at NIMS that we would love to see the same set of data being adopted there, where we can make a similar type of assessment rather than using different facts in that way. And EPA has been very, I think, very helpful in that way. So those interagency agreements, I think, are working well. And if we can continue that, the animal gene editing is an issue we still have to resolve.
So the FDA, you mentioned earlier, you're still having negotiations with them about what constitutes a transgenic.
We're still in the process of determining how. We don't want to, we have no reason to want to regulate gene editing in all animals, but we think the food animals, where the USDA has control of the protein source of America, makes sense.
I agree with you entirely. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. So I know you hear a lot about Hurricane Michael. You can hear one more thing. Our FSA office has struggled to meet the demand after the hurricane. I wonder what we can do to improve the staffing shortages caused by disaster-related claims. And you and I actually had a discussion a while back about a rapid response disaster team. Have you got any closer to that?
Once again, I answered a question earlier about the frustrating nature in a 3.5% unemployment rate of onboarding people into a federal job. I never would have thought we'd had that kind of difficulty. So some of the permissions we've been given over local hiring authority or really direct hiring authority is helpful, because we haven't found people who want to relocate. They can apply from other states and not want to relocate when you offer them a job.
Well, hopefully we can get them, a team that comes in for a few months and shores up the...
On the jump teams that way, certainly from hurricanes and disasters, we've tried to deploy those kind of teams on a temporary basis.
Yeah, that'd be outstanding. It'd really help us a lot. So USDA is still in discussion with the state of Florida about the block grant program. My good friend, Representative Lawson, mentioned that as well. And I think you did a pretty good job answering that, where that is. Keep the pressure up on them. We really want to help our, nobody's ever seen this much timber on the ground, and it's a threat to us now in terms of fires and disease.
We're doing that, and we're just trying to be reasonable as far as the balance of the acreage cap and how we did that. We had a very successful time in citrus. I thought that worked well. Florida did a good job, and I think we're going to get there soon. I think talks are developing very well.
So I want to take the opportunity to thank you and thank your staff, by the way, who's been very helpful, very easy to work with, and want to put it on the record that your help in making these programs occur, make them a reality, has just been critical to the recovery in my district, and I'm sure also Representative Lawson's. We want to continue to work with you on these projects, and we want to get a long-term fix for those, and we can't say thank you enough for all your efforts on our behalf, Mr. Secretary. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Dunn. I now yield myself 5 minutes, not because I'm in the chair, but because it's actually the order that I'm in. I'm serious. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here. As always, you cease to amaze me how you continually provide thorough answers to anything that you're asked. So I always appreciate that. And thank you for your visit to the Central Coast as well, coming out to my district and holding a town hall in my very blue district. So I appreciate that, your willingness to stand up there and give straightforward answers. And so I hope you do that today too with my question. I'm going to start off also with something that I don't normally do, and that's quoting our president, President Trump. Last year, at the Farm Bureau, he was talking about the current labor crisis. And he said, you need people to help you with farms, and I'm not going to rule that out. I'm going to make that easier for them to come in and to work the farms. You've had some people for 20, 25 years. They're incredible. Then they go home and they can't get back in. That's not going to happen. This is what he said, and he got one of the biggest ovations at that Farm Bureau meeting just because of that quote. Now, obviously, you know where I'm at on the legislation that we put forward and passed out of the House on a bipartisan basis, the Farm Workforce Modernization Act, a bill that protects our existing farm workforce and promotes an existing agricultural workforce. And earlier today, you mentioned the AWR, the Adverse Effect Wage Rate. Now, this bill, as you know, basically freezes that. Now, you were saying, I think you know that it would go up 6% in 2020. I got another list here. In Georgia, it's going to go up 5.2%. In Illinois, it's going to go up 9.5%. Kentucky at 6.6%. Minnesota 6.4%. Ohio 9.5%. The AWR is going up. This bill would freeze it for the first year. And then in years 2 through 9, it would put a cap on it at 3.25% and also put a floor at 1.5%. Mr. Secretary, don't you think that having a cap on the AWR will benefit people who deal with the H-2A process?
I think a cap would help, but I think we need to look at the AWR, or the adverse wage rate in a different kind of way. What people are telling me, even with availability now, by the all-in cost of transportation and other things, which don't have to happen in H-2B, the affordability issue is outside. We're seeing producers cut back on production all across the country. We've got examples in South Carolina. We've got examples in Colorado and the cicadas and sweet corn and others. So are in California as well.
Mr. Secretary, how would you feel about getting rid of the AWR?
I think we could do a more flexible AWR that adjusted, that looked toward the economy generally in that way. The original intent, as I understand, was not to exploit the foreign workers. We don't want to do that.
Correct.
That's not happening now. And also, we don't want to displace domestic workers. That's not happening because we don't have them out there.
Understood.
So I think we need to relook at that in that way, and I'd be very supportive.
And you know that basically in year 10, under the proposed legislation that passed the House, we'd have a study and the potential to get rid of it or relook at the AWR. You understand that?
That would be a good thing.
Understood. Now, also you talked about conflating the people who are here and as well as the H-2A process. Well, as President Trump said, there are people in my community, especially on the Central Coast of California, the salad bowl of the world, that have been here for 20 to 25 years, that have contributed so much, not just to our economy, not just to our agriculture, but to our community. I mean, they really are the culture of who we are on the Central Coast. And so I do believe that there needs to be a way to make sure that there is some way to protect those people. Doesn't mean you give them citizenship, but there's a way for them to earn it. And I believe that this bill provides that. Are you familiar with this way for those types of people who have contributed so much to our agriculture to earn the opportunity to stay here?
I think I'm familiar with those provisions, yes.
Okay. And you also, I mean, you said something recently that members of the White House leadership team would oppose the Farm Workforce Modernization Act. Is that correct?
I think yes.
And who would be those people?
I think the administration and White House in general.
Anybody in specific? I know you've had Ms. Boswell, who I appreciated, who's sitting behind you. She's done a very good job communicating with our office. I know she was sent to the White House. Would she have an idea of who these people would be?
I think maybe it'd be better for you to ask them. I'm sure they would be willing to submit to your questions.
As always, Mr. Secretary, I look forward to working with anybody who will help our ag labor situation.
And I appreciate it. It's really our number one and number two issue.
Agreed. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I appreciate that. I yield back my time, and I would go yield 5 minutes to Mr. Johnson from South Dakota.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, thanks for being here today. And we've had some discussion today about labeling with regard to protein beef specifically, and I want to continue on that line of discussion if that's all right. Sure. Of course, you get it. You know, folks in cattle country have some discomfort with the FSIS label of product of the USA. And I think there is some comfort level on a lot of the AMS quality claims and of some of these process verified programs like certified Angus beef. I'm not sure there's that same sense of accuracy and validity with regard to the product of the USA. Now, you have told us that you've got an idea about how to proceed. I want to make sure I heard that right. And then if you've got any idea about a timeline or what the way forward might look like, I'd be interested in that.
Yes, I think we're in a serious discussion. This is something we've been talking about for a number, as we hear the concerns, obviously, as you know, from cattle country. They don't quite understand why we can't just go back to cool, and you all do, but it's a very politically populist type of thing that's not going to happen unless we want to do $1 billion litigation damage with Mexico and Canada. We're trying to thread the needle, honestly, with transparency so the consumer can know what they get while also helping the producers to feel like they're getting value for cattle that have been processed, grown, and processed here.
And so what would the label, I mean, if you've got something that wasn't fully a product of the USA, as you look to thread that needle, what would be the new label that you mentioned?
The choices, excuse me for interrupting, I think the choices go to, the industry would love to have born, slaughtered, and processed in the United States. That, we believe, would violate the WTO suspension agreement. We think there's a middle ground of slaughtered and processed here, which is a different distinction than just processed in the United States. As it currently is, imported meat could come in, and if you cut it up and package it, that means processed in the United States. But slaughtered and processed means that live animal was here, and it was slaughtered and processed here in the United States. I think that's a better deal.
And I agree that the consumer deserves some of this additional information. And what you're talking about really does provide the consumer with a better insight into what is going on with that particular beef product.
And those would be voluntary labels also.
Okay. So moving to the Brazil issue, you know, there's been a fair amount of, I mean, in shortgrass country, I'm not sure people understand exactly what's happening with allowing Brazil to import beef into the United States. Can you talk to me a little bit about what processes are we putting into place to make sure that the American consumer can have confidence that Brazil has it right? Because as you know, Mr. Secretary, there have been a number of times in the past when Brazil has not had it right.
And I think that really should give comfort, Congressman, and that we've suspended them because they didn't get it right. They've had difficulty and fraud in their inspection system, and when we detected that on inbound inspections, we suspended them. I've suspended them for over 2 years, I think. But in countries where we have trade agreements there, aside from other just outright protectionism, we have to have equivalent safety standards. That's what FSIS does. They go down and do audits of their food safety inspection system to make sure that they believe it's equivalent to U.S. systems. And then as a safeguard beyond that, we also have a stepped-up inspection, not an audit, but an inspection of the product coming in to make sure they are continuing to comply.
And do we have a sense of how long that heightened inspection regime will be in place?
Not necessarily. I think it'll be dynamic as we see continued compliance over a period of months or years. You probably can see some relaxation to see that they're continuing to comply.
Well, my time is getting short, Mr. Secretary. I would close with just a couple of thank yous. I mean, you did work with a number of us to move the cover crop prevent plant harvest date last year during a true emergency situation. Of course, we don't know exactly what the weather in 2020 is going to look like, but if we get another terrible situation, hopefully there will be an open mind at USDA about similar flexibility for producers. And then finally, I am hearing increasingly from school nutrition experts that they really feel like they have a partner at USDA to try to get it right. I know you've got an open rulemaking. I don't expect you to comment at length, but thank you for your work, sir.
Well, we hear the same thing, where the trash can's not quite as fat as it once was.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. I now yield 5 minutes to Mr. McGovern from Massachusetts.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. I have some questions on SNAP. I remember a time when you came before this committee
when you first became secretary that I thought we were in sync on the SNAP program. I asked you when you became secretary, I wanted some assurances that you were a strong defender of the program, and I asked your views on the program because I was concerned about some of the rhetoric coming out of the administration. And you responded to me, and I quote, "But as far as I'm concerned, we have no proposed changes. You don't try to fix things that aren't broken." That's your quote. And then the Congress passed a farm bill that rejected proposals that would throw millions of people off the benefit. And then the administration, in defiance of Congress, goes forward with some proposals that would adversely impact very vulnerable people. And the first proposal dealt with able-bodied adults without dependents, ABODs, the proposal that you proposed last year. You appeared before this committee, and I asked you if USDA had any detailed data on this population, because I told you that we were hearing from people that this is a very complicated population. It included returning veterans. It included young kids just graduating out of foster care. And you said you did, and you get back to us. And USDA did get back to us. And what I received from USDA was that USDA only knows 3 things about this population: their age, their race, and their citizenship status. That's it. I asked if the group included veterans. They didn't know. I asked if the group included young people who had recently aged out of the foster care system. They didn't know. I asked if this group included people who were recently released from prison. They had no idea. I heard your assurances to Ms. Adams that, you're granting waivers, but the criteria is much more strict. And by USDA's own estimation, over 700,000 people will lose their benefit. Now, you add that to your proposed change with regard to categorical eligibility, essentially getting rid of it. And the other changes you have, there's another 3.1 or 2 million people by USDA's own numbers that will lose their benefit. Now, in your testimony here today, you said that the USDA serves out our motto, do right and feed everyone. Well, when I add all this up, by USDA's own numbers, close to 4 million people are going to be thrown off this benefit. 4 million poor people who get a SNAP benefit that's on average of about $1.40 per person per meal. Where are they going to get their food? How are they going to deal with this? And this ABOD population in particular, again, a very complicated population. Talk to faith-based groups. Talk to food banks. Talk to social service agencies. They will tell you how complicated this is, and yet you are making proposed rules changes, and USDA has no data on who is actually going to be impacted. I guess the question is, how can you do this?
Mr. Governor, we're not allowed to collect that information that you talked about, the various segments there. That state implements these rules, and we have no way to collect that information.
Well, with respect to not know who this population is, and then to cut them off, when we have a lot of data from states and from other organizations that deal with these people, who they are, returning veterans who are having trouble reintegrating into our workforce, people who live in rural areas, who have no access to transportation, the closest workforce training center may be 20 miles away, who don't have access to a job. I mean, when those people lose their benefit, they lose their food benefit. How making somebody hungry is going to make them more likely to get a job is beyond me, and that's before we get into the other rules changes. Again, 4 million people, by USDA's own estimation, are going to lose their food benefit. I think that's shameful. I don't know how that is consistent with the motto, do right and feed everyone. And I'm going to tell you, we're fighting you in court, and we are going to do everything we can to block the implementation of this. And I hope, I hope that we will get through this year, and then come next year we have a new set of people running our agencies who actually would be offended by throwing 4 million people off their benefit. I yield back.
I'd love the opportunity to have to respond, but it looks like time's up.
I'm happy to sit here and listen to the response if the chair wants to let you.
Please, Mr. Secretary.
Mr. McGovern, in 2000, we had 17 million people on food stamps. I don't know where all those poor people were you're talking about there. That's just a few short years ago. And during the recession, when unemployment went up, we had 44 million people on food stamps. Unemployment, in the longest economic boom we've seen here, unemployment at 3.5%. All I'm doing is implementing the law that was passed into this year that says the Secretary may waive the application of the work requirement to any group of individuals in the state if the Secretary makes a determination that the area in which the individual resides. You know the law says.
I do.
120 days if you're an able-bodied adult without dependents.
Right. And Mr. Secretary, you're hurting people.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you. Mr. McGovern, I yield 5 minutes to the co-chair of the Ag Research Caucus, Mr. Davis from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Mr. Secretary, thank you again for being here. You know, ag research ultimately plays a major role in our nation's economic prosperity, national security, and public health. With the current crisis that we're facing right now with the coronavirus and the potential link to an animal source, how can we help the department be better equipped to combat not only this strain, but future strains and diseases that can be transmitted from animals to humans, either through agricultural research or other USDA programs that might help prevent future public health threats?
The budget's been mentioned several times here today. I will do a appropriations hearing later, but I think if you look at the proposed budget this year from a research perspective, you're going to see quite a bit of bump in that just to address the very issues that you mentioned.
Well, thank you, Mr. Secretary. One of my biggest priorities since coming to Congress is in bolstering funding for ag research. I really appreciate working with you and your team on these ag research issues. I've worked alongside my good friend, the acting chair, Mr. Panetta, to co-chair the Ag Research Caucus, and we want to ensure that we're continuously increasing funding for AFRI programs. We hope to see appropriators, and I hope you can mention this during your testimony when you go see the ag appropriators. I hope we can also raise the money that's in AFRI, and I appreciate the President's request for increased funding for AFRI, but I think it's essential for us to move to the next level of research to fund the AGARDA program, Agriculture Advanced Research and Development Authority. And I certainly hope that's something that we can work with your department on to provide solutions in a high-tech, high-risk type of reward.
I think that fits right in, Congressman, with our new Ag Innovation Agenda that we've announced at the Ag Outlook Forum, and we would be happy to support that.
Well, thank you. You actually got into my next statement was about the Ag Innovation Agenda. I appreciate it. We appreciate the work that you're doing. Thank you for sitting here, and thank you for letting me come back to get in front of Yoho to ask questions.
Thank you.
I yield back, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. I now yield 5 minutes to Ms. Torres Small from New Mexico.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the entire Ag Committee. It's an honor to get to join you in this committee, and I'm grateful to get to advocate and represent the 10,000 farms in New Mexico's 2nd Congressional District, famous for our dairy, our pecans, our pistachios, and certainly our chili. So thank you so much, Secretary Perdue, for knowing that and for all that you do for rural America. When I talk with farmers, one of the first things I hear about are labor shortages. And Secretary Perdue, thank you for your commitment to this issue as well. The last time you testified before this committee, you spoke about that access to legal and stable workforce, so American-grown products will continue to feed our nation and the world. And just this morning, I appreciate your comments about working with Congress to help find a solution. The House passed the Farm Workforce Modernization Act with overwhelming bipartisan support, and I look forward to seeing our Senate colleagues engage on the subject. I strongly support a workable year-round visa system for our dairy farmers. And on that note, on the specialty crop side last year, you mentioned that you were working with Departments of Labor, Homeland Security, and the state to make the application process simpler for your training programs. When will the USDA application portal be ready?
The Department of Labor regulations are at OMB now. Hopefully they'll be released very soon for comment, and we're looking forward to that because the portal will be there. We have to have the rules there for the portal to be effective.
Have they given you a ballpark date?
OMB.
That's something you're eagerly awaiting?
We're waiting, right?
Okay, that's very good to know, so we can help. And are there any, so that would be the next near-term milestone for that. Do you have
We would hope this year.
Okay, thank you. What other specific steps is USDA taking to make it easier for farmers and ranchers to access the labor they need?
Again, if on the website, we try to give almost the documents and the things that you'll need in order to comply. So education is one thing, and we, Christy Boswell, as I mentioned, we deal one-on-one with producers coming in to have issues over visas and other things. I think the other exciting possibility is both from Mexico and Central America, with Guatemala and other Central American countries developing a pool of workers, almost like they do for Canada, a pre-certified group of people. And I know that the Secretary of Agriculture in Mexico is concerned about their poor peasant population in southeastern Mexico. So we'd love to work with those states, and there's been Guatemala's we're already signed an agreement, and I think to help that will facilitate the State Department visa moving forward.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I also really appreciate your comments about trade, not aid, and I'm pleased that we are making some strong advancements in that. I appreciate the discussion when it comes to the USMCA about Mexico and how do we make sure they're not restricting the cheeses. I wanted to go into another piece of the dairy, which of course is Canada's agreement. What steps will USDA take to ensure Canada complies with the terms of the agreement and eliminates their Class 7 pricing system?
Sure. I think we'll keep an eye on this Class 7 to make sure there's not a circumvention or a violation of that. These agreements that Ambassador Lighthizer is writing in the USTR are pretty legally contract enforceable type provisions, and I'm encouraged by that.
And one thing about those provisions is making sure not only they're eliminating this Class 7 system, but they're not reconstituting a similar one. Anything to add there?
Yeah, that's what I was mentioning with the circumvention of creating another loophole in that area. I think they're tight enough not to do that, and we'll be watching to call their hand on it if they do.
And please let us know if you see any challenges.
Right.
Lastly, just briefly, I appreciate that you brought that map, the MFP2 map, and I was wondering if you'd show it again. I do deeply appreciate the making sure that we are providing support as we're affected by trade. I know that there's a lot of different crops that were covered in that, and other important products, one of which is dairy, supporting the dairy industry. New Mexico's top 10 in the dairy industry, and it's a bright white there. So I look forward to working with you to make sure New Mexico gets the support it needs.
Get your share.
Thank you.
You burn me up with that green chili.
I yield the remainder of my time.
Thank you, Ms. Torres Small. I now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Hagedorn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, it's great to see you again. I want to thank you for traveling to our district in Minnesota to have a roundtable discussion in Mankato and also to attend Farm Fest. We enjoyed you holding up our USMCA Now sign, and also for the other folks in the administration who have helped at USDA, been on the ground in our district. Undersecretary Norty was at the Albert's Dairy Farm in Dodge County, and then this weekend Undersecretary Ibach will be at a hog farm, the Compart Hog Farm in Nicollet County. So we appreciate you being on the ground and meeting the farmers and getting to know what's on their minds continuously. So lots of politics today. You heard from people talking about trade and had some criticisms. But I'll tell you what I hear a lot, and that is it shouldn't have been left to this president to deal with China on trade. That should have happened a long time ago where we had presidents of both parties that kind of let things get to a point. And we appreciate the fact that he's taking it on. A lot of our farmers do. And the fact that we were able to pass the USMCA trade agreement to help build momentum for other deals, and we're seeing that now with phase 1 with China. Hopefully we get to phase 2. But there is something going on in China, as you know, this coronavirus, and it seems to be hampering perhaps our exports of pork and turkey and beef. And there seems to be a little backup there now, maybe as much as 11% it says for pork storage, and then 12% for poultry. Are you in any way dealing with what's going on as far as the backup and the storage issue?
Well, we try to be aware with our eyes on the ground there. We see some easing of that. More people are getting back to work at the ports, and we see some of that backlog continue to be unloading now. So hopefully we're over the worst of that and can move forward.
That's very good. Moving on to African swine fever. We've been talking about that quite a bit, and before everybody wants to talk about coronavirus, and rightly so, but this African swine fever, as you know, presents quite a challenge to us to make sure we keep that out of the country. and that we can even export more pork products. Recently, we passed a bill that the Senate sent over. It was along the lines of one that I put in to increase the number of inspectors at our points of entry and have more of the beagle brigades, which are very effective in sniffing out that pork. I always joke that they're so good we should take them down to the Appropriations Committee and try to drive down the deficit with those beagle brigades. But so when you look at what's going on, we appreciate the increase in the line item for swine health. That was very good. But you talked a little bit recently with our colleague from Kansas about the NBAF, I guess we call it, the acronym. How does that fit in with what we're doing on African swine fever? And then are you making some plans along those areas?
Well, obviously, it's not operational yet completely, but it'll be a huge part in all the dangerous global diseases that we face, African swine fever, and some we don't even know the names of yet. That will happen. Those research will be done. That'll be tested over the effects, and also research from how we can prevent that regarding vaccines and what the genome makeup is of that disease and the viruses or whatever organism carries that disease. So it'll be a really great tool over some very serious types of foot and mouth, African swine fever, Ebola, those kind of things that have zoonotic potentials there at NBAF.
You expect that'll go online in 2022?
Probably 22 to 23.
Okay, thank you. Lastly, just an observation. I appreciate what you're doing on the regulations with SNAP. It's an issue I've been working on since I served Congressman Stanglin, who was a member of this committee many, many years ago. And the concept of work for welfare for able-bodied people has always worked. And in this environment where we have very low unemployment, we want everybody in the workforce. It's a compassionate thing. And if people are able-bodied, I think it's the right thing to do. So I appreciate you tightening up the rules and pushing that forward. It's going to help a lot of people.
Thank you, Mr. Hagedorn. I now recognize the gentleman from Florida. Excuse me, the lady. You got me, Teddy. Miss Penegry.
Did Chairman Panetta forget about you?
No.
Almost. Mr. Secretary, thank you so much for being with us today and for putting in, I think, 3 long hours. The good news is we're about to vote, so eventually we're going to have to let you go. So, but I'm really grateful I've had a chance to listen to a lot of the hearing, and I know you've tackled a whole range of questions and given us a lot of thoughtful answers. I want to just talk a little bit about your sustainability initiative, part of the agriculture innovation agenda. You set a goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions from U.S. agriculture by 50% by 2050. So thank you for recognizing the importance of this and the integral role farmers can play in climate conversations. I think that's critically important. I introduced a bill last week called the Agriculture Resilience Act, which I sort of see as a roadmap for a lot of the things that we need to do around sequestering carbon and soil. And I think we have a lot of overlap in your innovation agenda and my bill around improving data collection and identifying research gaps, enhancing carbon sequestration. So I'm looking forward to working with you on that. I'm interested in knowing what some of your next steps for moving forward on the innovation agenda is and how we can be more helpful in Congress.
You mentioned one of those. I look forward to looking at your legislations, how we can sync up there. A baseline measurement is one of those things. You know, there was some effort made in 2010, and it just kind of, we did something initially there, and it just kind of got off the radar screen. But so we'd love to have a baseline of how we're moving. That scoreboard that we did at Ag Innovation Summit, you know, if you're not keeping score, you're just practicing, and you're not really serious about it. So we want to develop a metrics and of sensor technology and metrics over what percentage of carbon are we capturing through these practices? How can we do that? And that's where we plan to go.
That's great. That's critically important. I will just tell you, I look forward to you guys looking through the bill and having a longer conversation with you about it. Some of the things in that bill you can do with existing authority, things like making composting a practice within EQIP or CSP. So I hope we can find ways to work together as you're doing this, and if some of those things are favorable to you and we don't have to go through legislation, that would be great. The one last thing I wanted to talk to you about, there's so much interest in modernization of environmental services that farmers provide. I know we've talked about this before, but how are you working towards the USDA helping to foster some of those private sector efforts? And I know, honestly, just what you just said is sort of starting with a baseline is critically important, but I see a really serious role for USDA here in understanding how to monetize some of that.
I think what the Ag Outlook Forum talked about, the public-private partnership of synchronizing our public dollars and our private dollars, and I think USDA is an appropriate convener of where we are. We ought to be about asking the questions, and what we're doing is convening stakeholder groups and saying, what are the limitations? Let's imagine what can happen if this were solved, and put our researchers to work, both public and private, in doing that. That's kind of where we'd like to head.
Yeah, and I think that, again, I think there's a potential role for farmers to participate in carbon markets, and some of that has to do with, as you said, understanding what the baseline is, but also having a common set of measurements, because there's a lot of research going on at the university level and the private sector. I know you're looking at it at the USDA, but I think, again, that's an important convening role for you to play. I'm just really appreciative that in a time when, it's hard to get everybody on the same page around what's going on with the climate or what the appropriate role for farmers is in carbon sequestration, that you've come out and started talking about it, engaging farmers. One of the things I tried really hard to do in my bill was to look at how we treat farmers as our partners. Because all too often in this debate where people try to point the finger and say, it's all your fault. But the role that agriculture can play in sequestering carbon in the soil isn't very well understood. Even, with the environmental sector, people don't often understand how important that is and how so many of the practices that we can continue to encourage at the USDA, like no-till and cover crops and increasing the organic matter in the soil. So I'm looking forward to a way to move forward on that, to help people to understand the role, to engage farmers and sort of what works best for them. And, I have written 180 pages in a bill on that, so it's very thorough and detailed about what we could do.
Good. Looking at that. You're exactly right, though. And the possibility of really a win-win situation where you sequester carbon in the soil and taking it out of the air, but also that's increasing soil health and productivity. So it's a really a win-win situation.
Absolutely. Every farmer we've ever met with that we talked to who's taken some of these steps have seen, better water retention, increased yields, all kinds of good things. So I yield back, but thank you for putting in your time here. Thanks so much.
I thank the gentlelady from Maine. I now recognize the gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, always great to see you, and I appreciate the job you're doing, the leadership that you and the administration are doing. I stand 100% behind you. A lot of talk about COVID-19, the coronavirus. As you know, we've dealt with that in veterinary medicine for decades, from cattle, horses, dogs, and cats, and we've got very effective vaccines for it. We've introduced a bill, it's a bipartisan bill with Kurt Schrader, the other veterinarian in Congress, the One Health bill that coordinates the cooperation between USDA and HHS. As you well know, 6 out of 10 human diseases show up first in animals. And so this is a way that we can study that, be prepared, and it's a perfect example of that is, the #1 coronavirus. Lyme's disease, we saw that in veterinary medicine for a long time, and eventually the human side picked up on that. And mad cow's disease, BSE, we know these things are here in the animal world, and so the idea behind One Health is to coordinate that effort so that we can identify these things before they become a pandemic. And I just want people to know that's coming out. I was happy to hear your conversation about labor. As we know, our farmers face many uncertainties, whether it's commodity prices, weather factors, trade policies, and the availability of labor. I agree 100% with you that we should remove the labor issue for agriculture from immigration and concentrate on a guest worker program. That doesn't prevent anybody from becoming a citizen, but it doesn't give them the pathway. We're introducing our bill today that I've talked to you about, I've talked to the administration, and we've shared it with 70 members of the House and the Senate. It's called the Labor Certainty for Food Security Act. The goal is to create a predictable, reliable, certain workforce for our producers, but give opportunity to our workers. And this is both H-2A for the temporary, and it creates a year-round program. We get rid of AWR, and we put in safeguards for that. We allow the flexibility of the workers to move around the country, and I sure hope you consider this, because this is a solution for our ag producers that's it's so needed in that. It's been brought up about ASF, African swine fever. You're certainly aware of the outbreak, where it's estimated over 500 million pigs have been lost in China. The virus is very hardy, surviving high and low temperatures, and it can survive the transport from China to here, and it can last in the fomites. So feed products, cardboard, things like that haven't been thoroughly studied, and most of that stuff comes into our ports here in the United States. The beagles are a good tool, but I don't think they're scientifically as accurate as we need. I mean, I'll take them now every day. But I think what I'd like to ask you is, do you feel that the USDA has enough funding for resources and technology to bolster increased inspection? Because we know how little the containers are inspected.
Yeah, it's a needle in a haystack issue.
It is.
It's very kind of anxious in that regard. We do have a good working relationship with the Customs and Border Patrol. I've gone into borders and witnessed that. Obviously, you all have authorized recently some more inspectors at the border. The problem is there ever enough? What is safe in that regard, and how do you determine that? That's a real challenge, but we're trying to do our best to determine what the risk is versus what the need is.
We know what the percentage is being inspected and what the percentage is not. I don't want to bring that out right now, but I think that's something we all need to, look at bolstering. And lastly, the USMCA was passed. All nations need trade, but it needs to be fair trade. And as you know, my state of Florida, our vegetable producers have been crushed by the competition, primarily from Mexico, seasonality, or the seasonally competitive crops. My ask is, as we move forward, that close monitoring of the labor standards, environmental standards, subsidies coming from the Mexican government, and a rapid and quick response from this administration, USDA, USTR, that they respond rapidly. We've just seen inverse of the production of blueberries, squash, green peppers, any row crop. It's a complete reversal from 5 to 10 years ago. And we're not playing on a level playing field. And I sure hope that we can have some fixes for our producers. And just one last comment on the labor. We're either going to import our labor or we're going to import our food. And we need to make sure that our policies are in place so that we can protect our farmers. And I yield back and thank you for what you do.
Thank you, Mr. Yoho. Just to let you know, Mr. Secretary, votes have been called, but it looks like we have 2 more members. We're just going to get through those 2 real quick, if that's okay. Thank you. I recognize the gentlewoman from Iowa, Ms. Axney.
Thank you, Chairman and Ranking Member Conaway, and thank you, Secretary, for your
Thank you, ma'am.
It's good to see you. As you know, I represent the southwest corner of the state of Iowa, and our rural towns are the backbone of agriculture in our state. A lot of our rural economy depends, of course, on how corn and soybean farmers are doing, and these folks have had a tough few years over the last few years to devastating weather, demand destruction caused by the abuse of the small refinery exemptions and the EPA, and of course the administration allowed this to happen, and the uncertainty of a long trade war. These issues have absolutely hurt Iowa very hard. Iowa farmers hold the highest level of debt in the nation. 44% say they're struggling to cover bills, and farm bankruptcy in the state is at a 10-year high. With all these issues and the fact that a majority of Iowans are small or mid-sized farms, I was particularly disturbed when you suggested last fall that smaller farms aren't going to survive. As a matter of fact, you put it, in America, the big get bigger and the small go out. I think it's your job to keep that from happening. And we're here today to discuss the state of the rural economy, and with things as grim as they are, it's really discouraging for my constituents to hear from the Secretary of Agriculture that their best option may just be to sell their family farm. The last thing our folks need is additional stress and uncertainty. So I'm hoping that your testimony today will provide some reassurance to my constituents. And I'm very glad that we got USMCA signed into law, and I'm thankful for your announcement of the Higher Blends Infrastructure Incentive Program, as well as the department's work on the China Phase 1 agreement. However, a lot of my folks have questions about whether the Chinese commitment for ag purchases is realistic. Iowa farmers are on the front line of this trade war and have taken a lot of the hit for this. It's imperative that the agreement results in gains for Iowans. Last month, USDA's own chief economist estimated that exports to China would only be $14 billion at the end of the third quarter, which is a heck of a long way from the $36.5 billion goal for 2020 that was agreed to. So my question, Secretary, is do you expect that China will be able to meet its commitments, and what commodities do you expect to benefit the most under the Phase 1 agreement?
We are expecting China to live their agreement. The underlying, under-the-radar technical issues are being worked on fairly expeditiously. I think that leads to their ability to accomplish those hardline goals, but we're going to trust but verify as we go along and looking on a week-by-week, month-by-month basis of where they are in that regard. There are unilaterally enforcement mechanisms to enforce that commitment and money and things they've agreed to. So we do. We think the Usda report that you mentioned was stated in the preamble that it did not include the Phase 1 agreement in that effort. So the export numbers that you talked about, we expect will grow.
Okay, great. And which commodities do you expect should receive the most benefit?
Well, I think all commodities. The non-public part of the agreement and the $40 to $50 billion of U.S. ag exports were not identified by sector purposely because the Chinese wanted the ability to come into the marketplace as fair buyers in that regard. So we think all sectors are really a huge majority of that, of the agricultural sector will benefit. Certainly your farmers in Iowa from a corn, even ethanol perspective, DDGs, those kind of things, we think will have a great potential of helping to China achieve those numbers, things that we've not sent over there recently, such as ethanol byproducts.
Okay, good. So I'm glad to hear you say DDGs, so I appreciate that. I'd like, if you can give us any follow-up on, as we move down the road, what we can expect to see for ethanol and DDG, I'd be really
these tracking documents will be public for to be seen as how we're doing on those issues.
Okay. Moving on, I just wanted to ask you real quick here as well. How is the USDA estimating potential purchases in the commodity market forecast reports, and how are you making sure you aren't adding to the volatility in the commodity market?
Our NASS reports you're referring to? Mm-hmm. This consistent protocol we mentioned earlier when you were out, that the disturbing report that came about in the summer was because it was out of line. The NASS report was out of line with market expectations because of the wet spring and prevented plantings. As it turned out, Ms. Axney, the NASS was right and the market was wrong. It created a huge drop in price because the markets and all the traders and estimators thought there was going to be less corn than there was. NASDAQ had a much more. Farmers thought it was a conspiracy to drop down prices, but at the end of the year, the NASS report was much more consistent with where the production was than the other people in the private sector.
Okay, thank you so much.
Okay. And I wish you knew me better. Maybe we can get to know better. You'll know that nobody fights harder for American farmers. And I think the quote you took out of context, I'd love the opportunity to talk to you about that.
Well, I would appreciate that. It is what you said. If you want to set up a time so we can get to know each other better, I'd really be grateful for that.
It is what it was quoted, but I think we can all be clipped and in a way that is not accurate.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you.
I recognize a gentlelady from Arizona for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here.
Thank you for your patience.
Yes, contrary to the popular belief that Arizona is all desert, we have some beautiful, beautiful forests. And we're coming up on our wildfire season. And so I want to just ask you quickly, we've seen an increase in temperatures, a decrease in moisture, and this has caused a rise in wildfires, and I'm sure you're well aware of that. So I'm going to get briefly to my question, which has to do with the wildfire funding fix. How will that fix help you better manage suppression efforts? And how do you expect the funds will impact other aspects of Forest Service work?
Good. Two ways. The fire funding fix allows us to take the appropriations that you give for forest management and do active forest management. That's the prevention phase of that. Then the other part of is that we can treat forest fires like we do other disasters and spend the money expecting that to be replenished in that way at that level. So it's really a bifurcation. But the most important thing is do the active forest management to prevent the forest fires. We'd much rather prevent them than suppress them.
Yeah, absolutely. We've seen some money going into thinning the forest.
Yes.
Picking up the shrub, and
Right.
And that certainly helps us manage better. So because they've called votes, I'm going to yield back the balance of my time. But again, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Before we adjourn, I invite Ranking Member to make any closing remarks he may have.
Well, a couple things. First off, Mr. Secretary, thank you again for the great job your team does. Great leadership from you, but executed by an awful lot of good folks over there. I also want to thank Bill Northey and Richard Fordyce and Kevin Norton for coming over yesterday and spending a long time with the full committee going over all these staffing issues, hiring challenges, all the things that you've been harassed about this morning. They're doing a terrific job, professional job of addressing that. They understand the problems associated with the moves to Kansas City, all the things that are going on. So thank you for their good work. I also want to quickly comment on the SNAP changes you're making. Throughout the Farm Bill negotiation with my colleagues in the Senate, they assured me over and over and over again, ad nauseum, that you had all the authority that you needed to do what you're doing with respect to the ABOD rule and broad-based categorical eligibility, and that we did not need to include it in the House-passed version, did not need to be included in the conference report. My colleagues on this, Mr. McGovern is particularly passionate about this issue, but passion doesn't necessarily create good policy. And good policy is that the rules in place from the 95 Act that said able-bodied adults under the age of 50 with no dependents should work or train to work 20 hours a week in order to stay on food stamps on an extended basis. And you have the authority to waive that particular rule in places where it makes sense, in the rural areas or where there are no jobs. All of the folks that Mr. McGovern talked about have an ability to be waived. The rule also provides a 12% exemption for every state to exempt 12% of their ABOD population all the time. And so there's plenty of flexibility to address all those folks. And again, passion doesn't make good policy. Your changes to the rules does make good policy. I wish we could have gotten them into the law that you're now operating under. Again, thank you and your team especially for all the hard work they do, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Conaway. Mr. Secretary, once again, I really, truly appreciate every time you come to this committee and demonstrate your thoughtful and your knowledgeable answers to all of us here. It really means a lot to all of us on this committee. So on behalf of Chairman Peterson, thank you very much. I also want to say thank you for the accessibility, not just of you, but your staff, and how well that we've been able to work with them and how often they come up here and talk to us. So thank you very much. And also just to let you know, and as you can tell, this is the first time I've ever chaired a committee meeting, but let you know what an honor it is that you were the witness for the first time that I have ever been in this position, and let you know that I will never forget this opportunity, but also let you know that the people of this country and the people in agriculture will not forget your service to them and to this nation. So thank you very much. And at this time, under the rules of the committee, the record of today's hearing will remain open for 10 calendar days to receive additional material and supplementary written responses from the witness to any question posed by a member. This hearing of the Committee on Agriculture is adjourned.
Chairman Panetta, that has a good sound to it, right?